On motion number S4M 06225 in the name of John Swinney on universal services. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Mr Swinney, to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, 14 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, the programme for government published in September 2012 set out the Scottish Government's ambitious vision of the nation Scotland should be in the future, a prosperous and successful country reflecting Scottish values of fairness and opportunity and promoting equality and social cohesion. It is this vision that guides the policies the Scottish Government is taking forward across all of our public services through the Government's economic strategy and is reflected in the choices that we set out in the spending review in 2011 and in our budget for this year agreed by Parliament in February. A key part of this vision is the social contract the Government has made with the people of Scotland. Everyone recognises that the public finances are under pressure, and indeed we have just been discussing some of the implications of those pressures in Parliament a moment ago. But at a time when many people in Scotland are facing hardship and change, the Government is determined that it should focus on ensuring the quality and stability of public services for people in Scotland is at the heart of the decisions that we take. It is nearly 2 years since the First Minister set out a range of measures in his opening statement to the new Parliament that support the Scottish Government's commitment to a social wage, including the protection of a number of vital universal benefits and services that affect individuals in our country. Those services and provisions include the freezing of the council tax, the continued support for free personal care, the abolition of tuition fees, free prescriptions, free eye tests, the continuation of concessionary bus travel and increasing the amount of free nursery care that is available to our citizens. Many of these provisions have been introduced with the broad agreement of Parliament over the course of the years of devolution, and the Government brings forward this debate to take forward that wider agreement on these important public services. At a time when Scotland must come to terms with the further reductions to public spending set out in the recent UK budget, coupled with the welfare reforms of the UK governments, today's debate provides Parliament with an opportunity to consider the agenda taken forward by the Government and provides me with the opportunity to confirm that the Scottish Government remains committed to the course that was set out in the spending review, having made the choices that we made around the support financially for public services in Scotland.
I share many of the ambitions that the Finance Secretary set out, but I want to have confidence that we can sustain these policies into the future. Others have argued for projections, maybe 10 years projections on many of these policies. Is that something that he will announce that he will agree to today?
It's in the subject of Mr Brown's amendment, and it's a point that Mr Brown's made in the past. I'm not going to agree that today, because that would essentially involve me talking about one element of our budget when our budget is a much broader and more comprehensive proposition, and indeed it also relates to the fact that we will not have all of the financial information that enables us to set out that comprehensive picture that I have just talked about. What I can say to Mr Rennie is that, having gone through the exercise of commissioning the independent budget review, which, for the sake of the record, provided a list of possible suggestions to improve the sustainability of the public finances, greater than we actually required to implement, and also taken forward the work of the Christie Commission, the Government has taken steps, and I will set out what those are in the course of my contribution today, to ensure that the public finances are sustainable and that we can take forward the variety of measures to which the Government is committed as part of the balanced budget that we set. Of course, yes.
That's quite puzzling, because if he's relying so much on the independent budget review, why did he reject so many of the recommendations which were based on sustainability?
But the point I just made to Mr Rennie was the fact that the independent budget review provided us with a list of possible options in excess of the savings that we are required to make. So I was not obliged to accept the entirety of the independent budget review. I accepted a whole series of very challenging recommendations which I have subsequently implemented to make the public finances of the Scottish Government sustainable, and providing us with the ability to ensure that members of the public are not the first to suffer as a consequence of the tightening of the financial constraints within which we operate. Our approach is... I will give way.
Gavin Brown.
I'm very grateful for him taking a third intervention so quickly. He said it would be difficult to provide the 10-year projections and perhaps too much work would have to be done in order to do so, but does he acknowledge that he did provide projections to the independent budget review in 2010, so why can he not do longer-term projections now?
Well, some of the information that we provided to the independent budget review was at their request, but what I'm trying to say in my response to Mr Rennie, which is the point which I've always maintained in my response to Mr Brown, is that the question of the sustainability of individual elements of the public services will be dependent on the variety of budget choices that we make, and the government, to enable us to present that information in the round on a comprehensive basis, we would need to have 10-year financial information from the United Kingdom Government to enable us to do that, and that information is not forthcoming, so I don't see the purpose of the exercise. The duty of the Government is to make sure that the decisions we take, which we have done, enable the public finances to be sustainable as a consequence of the agenda that we take forward in the Scottish Parliament. The Government's approach is founded on our belief that in a fair and equitable society, and also by a wider conviction that, together with our investment approach, our policies, that the steps that we take will improve the outcomes that are experienced by members of the public as a consequence of the public service policies that the Government takes forward. There is a sharp contrast in the approach and direction on public policy in many of these areas that are taken by the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government with the approach being taken on welfare reform in the United Kingdom Government. The Scottish Government is doing what it can to mitigate the worst effects of welfare reform, and with our local government partners we have invested £40 million to address the funding gap for council tax support this year after the UK Government reduced the budget by 10%. We are providing an extra £9.2 million for the Scottish Welfare Fund, giving a total of £33 million and allowing us to add an additional 5,600 community care grants and an additional 100,000 crisis grants for those groups who need it most. We are providing a funding package of £5.4 million for organisations providing frontline advice and support services to those affected, and we are providing a further £2.5 million to social landlords to ensure people affected by housing benefits changes have the advice and the support that they need. So these are measures that we are taking to fulfil our approach, which is designed to advance the agenda of tackling inequality in our society, which we believe will be exacerbated by the agenda of welfare reform taken forward by the UK Government. This is, of course, consistent with our response to the analysis provided by the Christie Commission, which essentially focused on how we can tackle inequalities in Scotland and pointed us in a direction which the Government has accepted, to shift towards a more preventative and anticipatory series of approaches which will first and foremost improve the outcomes experienced by members of the public by reducing demand and improving access to public services as a consequence. And those attributes of the Christie Commission report, which laid a heavy emphasis on preventative interventions, a significant emphasis on the creation of partnership working between public services at local level, which is implicit in the health and social care reforms that Mr Neil is taking forward, the greater investment in people delivering public services and the sharp focus on improving performance within the public services are all a recognition of the way in which the Government has taken forward this agenda. Now, to enable the Government to ensure that the public finances are sustainable, and to address the points that were made by Mr Rennie and Mr Brown, we have required there to be a whole process of efficiency savings made across the public sector within Scotland, and a requirement for a 3% efficiency saving across the public sector. In line with the independent budget review, we have taken the difficult decisions to constrain public sector pay costs, which account for around 55% of the annual Scottish revenue budget, while offering protection for those on the lowest incomes and, crucially, providing as part of our social wage agreement with the public a guarantee of no compulsory redundancy within the public sector, within the government community within Scotland. Now, in addition to all of those steps that we have taken, there have been a range of other measures that we have taken to ensure the sustainability of the public services. The establishment of a single police service for Scotland, the establishment of a single fire and rescue service, is designed to not only improve local services, to create more equal access to specialist support and to strengthen national capacity, but it also has had the objective of saving resources from the public purse, from the way in which the police and fire services are organised in Scotland. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice has just been talking a moment ago about the Making Justice Work programme, which has been designed to create a fairer, accessible and efficient justice system, but delivering savings into the bargain. We are embarking on a major restructuring of further education provision in Scotland. We are taking forward, through the work of the Children's Minister and the Public Health Minister, the focus on the Early Years Collaborative to ensure that we are anticipating some of the challenges that exist in future demand for services. And the Reshaping Care Change Fund has been designed to essentially usher in the reforms that are required in relation to the delivery of adult health and social care services in Scotland. So all of these are some of the tough and difficult decisions that the Government has taken to ensure that our public services are sustainable. And what these have enabled us to do is to give the commitments that have been given as part of the budget to ensure that the range of services that are available to members of the public in a time of acute financial pressure are services that can be maintained. In 2011, we removed prescription charges, potentially saving those with long-term illnesses around £104 per year, by comparison with the level of prescription charges south of the border, and ending what we consider to be an unfair tax on ill health. Some have argued that we should reconsider and introduce a means-tested approach, but the National Audit Office have demonstrated that the cost per claim of delivering means-tested benefits tend to be higher than those for contributory or universal benefits, even where benefits have similar target groups. Freezing the council tax has, in relative terms, benefited households with the lowest income the most. The cumulative saving for an average household over the period 2008 to 2013 is over £500, and by extending the freeze for the lifetime of this Parliament, the same household will have benefited by around £1,200 in total, based on an additional £70 million being provided each year. University education remains free in Scotland, saving students up to £27,000 compared to the cost of studying in England from autumn 2012. We have seen record numbers of Scottish applicants to Scottish universities, while in the same period we have seen drops in applications to English universities. UCAS data shows acceptances to Scottish institutions for 2012-13 are up by 1.9%, compared to a 6.3% decrease at English institutions. I will do if yes.
Ask the Minister. He's very happy to tell us about record numbers of applications to higher education. Can he tell us exactly how successful he has been dealing with applications to Scotland's colleges and further education institutions?
Well, Mr Macintosh will know full well that the Government gave a commitment to maintain the number of full-time equivalent places at Scotland's colleges, and that is a commitment that we have fulfilled. Yes, we have changed the shape of the nature of the provision. We have gone from a larger number of part-time courses to more full-time courses, which have been designed to strengthen the ability of younger people to enter the labour market with a more sophisticated and grounded level of skills. And I think we are beginning to see from the successive falls in youth unemployment that we have been experiencing that strategy is bearing fruit for the young people of Scotland. We are committed to maintaining the progress made on free personal and nursing care. We have protected the health budget, meaning that by 2014-15, the resource budget of the National Health Service will be more than £1 billion higher than it was in 2010-11. There are other services that we provide on a universal basis, whether it's about free eye tests, which the RNIB Scotland have estimated proactively deal with costs that could be in excess of £17,000 per patient per year as a consequence of these steps that we take. And the continuation of concessionary bus travel means a benefit to many of our older citizens in their social mobility and their personal well-being. So, Presiding Officer, the Government has taken a series of difficult decisions to balance the public finances, to ensure that we take wise steps to ensure their sustainability, but crucially, in a time of fiscal constraint, to protect the services that matter to the people of Scotland. That is the approach this Government has chosen to take to give life to the values that we believe are important for the longer-term benefit of Scotland, and those provisions are contained in the motion that is before Parliament in my name, which I move this afternoon.
Many thanks. And I now call on Ken McIntosh to speak to and move Amendment 6225.3. Mr McIntosh, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and it's great to be back after the Easter recess. Thank you very much for that warm welcome from the SNP benches. Presiding Officer, I believe the SNP have called this debate not so much with a view to taking a rigorous look at the public finances, but more with the express aim, or I should rather say the hope, of trying to embarrass the Labour Party. I'll be honest, Presiding Officer, rather than making any political capital themselves, I believe the embarrassment is the SNP's. This is a subject that has been looked at in depth by the Christie Commission, by the Beveridge Report, and of course is being looked at by the Scottish Labour Party. It would appear the only party that is not taking this issue seriously is the SNP, and yet they are the party of government. Even the language the SNP use, Presiding Officer, says more about their mindset than it does about the Labour Party's approach. They're always talking about cuts rather than the values of our public services or the needs of people in our community. The very reason it is important to look at how we deliver public services in this country is to protect those services. There are so many changes going on at the moment, not least driven by the austerity agenda of the Tory government at Westminster. Even if the SNP government were to do nothing, and let's not kid ourselves, they are already cutting all kinds of public support that is vital to so many lives. But even if they were to do or say nothing, the shape of our public services would change simply because the nature of our society and our demography is changing. We want people to live longer, happier, healthier lives, and to do that, we need to change the nature of how we deliver our services. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Labour Party have tried to generate a public debate on public services, but we certainly have not come to any firm conclusions in terms of reviewing our stance on policy. Having said that, if I can give my thoughts on one policy, concessionary travel, I hope it might illustrate why it is important to have an open and honest discussion on this matter. First of all, let us remember that free travel for older people was not introduced by the SNP, nor the Tories, but by the Scottish Labour Party. It is a Labour Party policy, delivered by a Labour-led government with huge benefits for older people in Scotland, and I think it still ranks as one of our most important achievements. In fact, as I remember at the last election, it was SNP candidates who were actually threatening the bus pass for older people across the country. That's my recollection. In fact, some of the loudest protesters are the ones who are actually challenging the bus pass. But
a little order, please.
What is happening in practice? While on the face of it, the SNP government remain committed to keeping concessionary travel, in practice, they are drastically reducing their support for bus transport. They have already reduced the bus operators grant and, crucially, the level of subsidy for concessionary pass from 67 pence in the pound to 58 pence in the pound. The net effect, as all of us in the Chamber know, and certainly all the people in our constituencies know, is that bus services are being cut. And if they're being honest, the SNP backbenchers know this too. In my area, in just this week, one of the most important routes has been cut from 3 times an hour to 2 times an hour. Several communities are entirely isolated in the evening, and I know this picture is being repeated across the country. Now, the trouble with the SNP's approach is that they are essentially making a political calculation that they can foist the blame onto someone else. They can either blame the bus companies, the local authorities or the Tory government. I'm not saying that each of these bodies does not have a role to play, but the key decisions are being taken by SNP ministers. The cut in the level of subsidy from 67p to 58p and the level of the bus operators grant have been hugely significant, and they are clearly and directly the responsibility of Scottish Government ministers. So the SNP are cutting all the time. One second. In those circumstances, their supposed commitment to concessionary travel becomes a mask to hide behind, rather than a genuine policy by itself. Mr Hepburn.
The member sets out his party's love for the concessionary travel scheme. Is that why his party refused to back the scheme at the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee when it was before that committee?
Ken McIntosh.
Well, I think if Mr Hepburn would allow me to finish my remarks, he'll see where I'm heading. And certainly, if he's not been listening already, he may conveniently forget that it was us that introduced this policy. It is us that introduced this policy. There is no question about our commitment to the free bus pass.
Order.
The question mark is over the SNP's actual commitment to decent public transport and decent services for older people in this country, because they're being cut. They are being cut by the SNP. And can I suggest, Presiding Officer, that the danger of not having an open and honest debate about this matter is that cuts will still happen, as they are now, but the agenda will be shaped by others. The language of the debate, for example, will be entirely that of the Tories, of reducing the supposed burden of the state. I don't have to look far to illustrate my point. We have just seen the introduction of radical changes to disability living allowance, predicated not on the basis of need, but on their cost to the public purse. The Tory government claim there will be a needs-based assessment, but the policy started from a basis that the department wanted to make cuts of 20%, and the policy was then designed to deliver those 20% of cuts. And it's little wonder that people are so sceptical and there's so little trust in the Tory government. If the SNP do not join the Labour Party and have a genuine discussion about how public services are shaped, we will not actually have services that reflect our values. We will not have services that liberate older people, that give us independence in later years, that allow people to live longer, healthier lives. We will have public services that are seen entirely as a drag, as a burden on society, not as something which is beneficial. It is already far too easy to fall into the trap that all taxation is bad and that the duty of government is to keep spending to a minimum. Yes, public spending has to be controlled because it is too important to the way we live our lives to treat irresponsibly. But taxation is the mark of living in a civilised society. Can I suggest, Presiding Officer, I cannot say what the conclusions of our review will be, but I will be astonished if it does not allow us to reaffirm our support, the Scottish Labour Party's support for concessionary transport for older people, but to allow that to go forward in an affordable and sustainable basis. In other words, it's a way of securing bus services for older people rather than cutting them, which is what the SNP are already doing. And of course, the same argument that is made about buses can be made about education. The much vaunted SNP commitment to free tuition, which I heard the Minister repeat, is totally undermined by the fact that 120,000 fewer Scots are attending college. What sort of party trumpets access for some to higher education while slamming the door for others, so many others, to further education? All that work we did over the first decade of this Parliament, narrowing the gap between the vocational and the academic, undermined by an elitist approach which seems to consider Scotland's colleges as a second-best option. And, Presiding Officer, precisely the same argument can be made for prescription charges. Whilst ministers brag about free prescriptions, thousands of Scots are being denied access to medicines available throughout the rest of the UK. This country, Scotland, used to be in the forefront of making available new treatments for patients, but under the SNP we now enjoy the worst reputation in the UK. We are in the farcical and almost certainly unsustainable position. Instead of sorting out a robust and fair system for accessing drugs, we have a health minister sitting here today responding to bad headlines by finding 21 million somewhere from his budget. Now, goodness knows that money is welcome, but what would be far more welcome would be an individual patient treatment request system that actually worked. I do not want the SNP to boast to me, to the Parliament or to patients across Scotland that they are providing free prescriptions for all, when the price of this policy is no prescription from the few who desperately need help. Mr Swinney.
John Swinney.
If Mr McIntosh would set out what the Labour Party's position is on the issue of charging people with long-term conditions for their prescriptions.
Ken McIntosh.
The Labour Party is in the middle of a policy review, and we will be more than... The Labour Party is more than happy to contest elections on the basis of policies that we think the Scottish public will find attractive, genuine policies that will provide care for our older people and, at the same time, reveal the hypocrisy of an SNP government who pretend to the Scottish public that they are protecting services while all the time you're undermining the care system. The very free personal care that we introduced, the Labour government again introduced, undermined and now reduced to 15-minute cares. Do you know, I genuinely believe that the hallmark, the defining characteristic of this SNP government will be the 15-minute care visit. Not actually genuine care for older people, but a system that strips away respect and dignity and genuine warmth. And that will be the defining characteristic of this government. And so, Presiding Officer, we have the SNP hiding behind the front of alleged support for universalism, whilst all the while cutting those very services. But what I find even more cynical is that we know that SNP ministers, at least, are having this very same debate, but keeping it secret from us. And how do we know? Because the Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, tells us so. Yes, in the gift that keeps giving, the leaked Cabinet paper, which John Swinney briefed in secret his own colleagues with, has a number of paragraphs which I'd like to quote from. Paragraph 27, there are also inherent real terms cost pressures within public sector budgets. The same paragraph, we will need to be mindful that these pressures could reduce the resources available to provide additional public services. Paragraph 29, all things being equal, this means that some budgets will have to rise in real terms simply to ensure that demand for existing public services can be met. So clearly in private, John Swinney and not the backbenchers we get in the dark, but John Swinney and the frontbench colleagues are having this debate about the real pressures that are facing the government. And do you know, Presiding Officer, do you know what the remedy that this same minister then offers his colleagues? The remedy, he says we should look at the affordability of pensions. The affordability of pensions. Well, that silenced them suddenly. That's suddenly hit a nerve, has it? That's a bit more drastic than looking at some public service, the affordability of pensions. And furthermore, I quote exactly, and to constrain total increases. I'll finish now, President. And to constrain total increases in payable costs through managing the size of the workforce. Do you know what that means, managing the size of the public sector workforce? That means public sector job cuts. So here we have a government that's basically saying that public sector jobs will go to save the political face of SNP ministers. That is not fair, that is not just, that does not protect the services or the values of the people of Scotland. I urge Parliament to reject the Minister's cynical motion and to accept Labour's amendment.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Gavin Brown to speak to and move Amendment 6225.2. Mr Brown, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think the debate around universal services is one that we must have, and I think the debate would be best served if it was conducted in an open and transparent manner. Because what I think is really lacking at the moment in the debate is an evidence base. The critical step, I think, incumbent on the Scottish Government at this stage is to gather a clear evidence base on the projected costs of the universal services which we have in Scotland, an analysis too of the benefits, so that we compare the costs with the benefits, and thirdly, a comparison with other potential policy initiatives, so that as a Parliament and as a Government, the correct priorities can be decided upon. Because of the financial settlement we have at the moment and the demographic challenges that we face as a country, to do nothing, in my view, is not an option. And this is where I am surprised at the response of the Scottish Government so far to our, I think, reasonable request that we get 10-year projections of the likely costs of the universal benefits. That surely to goodness has to be a starting point in looking at where we are likely to go and looking at whether they are affordable or not in the medium and longer term. Now, the reasons given so far by the Cabinet Secretary, and he'll forgive me as I had to scribble it down as he was talking, but the first reason given for not doing so is because our budget is a wider proposition. That to me does not explain at all why he is unable or unwilling to give us projections of the likely costs of universal services. When I pointed out that he was able to give the information to the independent budget review in 2010, he said he was able to do so, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but he'll correct me if I am, he was able to do so because they requested it. Well, Deputy Presiding Officer, we in this Parliament are requesting now that he does so over a 10-year period so that we can fairly judge what the likely costs of these policies are. When we then have clear information in front of us, decisions can then be taken to decide what the priorities ought to be. Because I don't accept his argument. He basically claimed that because he hasn't been given a 10-year budget from the UK government, it's impossible for him to do so. And he's nodding his head as I say that. Now, I acknowledge that he hasn't been given a 10-year budget from the UK government, but the point about universal services is this. They are demand-driven engines in our budget. They depend upon demand, and what we're asking for is what does he think the demand will be and the cost of meeting that demand if there are no changes to the current schemes. We are not saying exactly how much will you spend on them, because yes, if you don't have, well, perhaps he says that perhaps he wants to now stand up and tell us that he will give us the projected expenditure on those items if there are no changes to them. He seems unwilling to do so, and I hope later on in this debate the Scottish Government will finally accede to our request to tell us what they think the projected costs will be. Because we face a financial challenge which is well known and well documented and is likely to be the case for the next few years. Many of the decisions about universal services were taken at a time when we simply couldn't spend all the money that we had as a Parliament. Money built up in terms of end-year flexibility because we couldn't spend the money at the time in the first two terms of this Scottish Parliament. The situation is different now, Deputy Presiding Officer, coupled with the recent report from the Finance Committee about the demographic challenge we face in Scotland. There are opportunities too, of course, but that doesn't mean we can ignore the challenge. The National Records of Scotland said to the Finance Committee in written evidence that the working age population would increase by 7% by 2035. The pensionable age population would increase by 26% by 2035, and those aged 75 or over would increase by 82% by 2035. With such increases, Deputy Presiding Officer, that will clearly have an impact on the universal services that we currently have. Happy to give a sure.
Mark MacDonald.
The member would appreciate that such projections are merely projections, and, for example, a well-honed targeted immigration policy could address some of that. Does he agree that his party at Westminster does not have a well-honed targeted immigration policy at present?
Gavin Brown.
I think Mr MacDonald is making a mistake there, because our demographic challenge has been well documented for several decades now, long before the coalition government came into place. And I realise he wasn't on the Finance Committee when the report was published, but if you look across the whole of Western Europe and the First World, regardless of what their immigration policy is, they have a very similar problem to us. In fact, Germany and the Netherlands and Finland, for example, are expected to have a greater difficulty and challenge to us, according to figures given to the Finance Committee. So I don't accept his argument that that actually is at the heart of the issue. I only have 20 seconds less, Deputy Presiding Officer, so I have to, I'm afraid, decline that particular intervention. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, we face demographic challenges that we know about, and we face difficult financial challenges. That is why it is important to target our resources where they are most needed. You can then release savings to other government priorities, and we should stop providing universal services, particularly, for example, concessionary travel, where those who are willing to pay 100% can well do so. As Robert Black, the former Auditor General, said on the concessionary travel scheme, the cost of providing free transport to people who are over 60 and still in employment is £34 million or so. That is deadweight expenditure, if ever I saw it. And I challenge anyone in this Parliament to say surely there could be a better way of spending that £34 million in terms of pursuing the Government and the Parliament's priorities. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move Amendment 6225.1. 6 minutes, Mr Rennie, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Gavin Brown is right when he says quite clearly this is about choices. And I think everybody in this Parliament knows that they get elected to this chamber in order to make choices. And the choice is not between targeted and universalism, because we have a mixture of targeted support and universal support. That is quite clear. But that is what the SNP want us to try and believe that the choices are. The choices are between my party, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, who are against universalism, and only the SNP who are in favour of universalism. And that's clearly, patently, not the case. Now, I've given an example quite clearly here. In England this week, mothers and fathers are investigating whether their 2-year-old child will be eligible for nursery education, free nursery education, in September. Parents who are out of work, they're receiving benefits, will be able to apply, and it could change those kids. It could change their chances of their life. It's not universal, it's targeted, but I think it's a good thing to have. Now, everybody, I think, seems to welcome this, apart from the SNP, and despite us putting forward costed plans, not just now. We've put forward costed plans for this. Now, that is a choice that the SNP have made. Now, I criticise them for it, but I don't believe it's some golden principle that they're rejecting it for. But they seem to believe that universalism is a golden principle. But if you look what the SNP are doing right now, this government, they are charging for essential dental treatment. And I looked this morning at some of the charges. They're free for check-ups, but if you look at root canal treatment, it's £37. A single crown is £68. Now, this is basic dental care, and it's charged by the NHS. It's not universally free, it's charged. Eye treatment, exactly the same. Check-ups are free, introduced by the government that Ken McIntosh was a member of, along with the Liberal Democrats, that introduced free bus travel. Ken McIntosh, together. But treatment, but eye treatment, glasses, contact lenses are charged for. So they're charged for. So these are not free, they're not universal, but I don't hear the SNP describing those as a tax on short-sighted people or a tax on teeth. I don't hear that claim. Why don't we hear that claim? Not just now. And if you look at Perth and Kinross Council, John Swinney's own council, they charge for services I would regard as quite essential services for home care charges. £11.47 per hour for home care charges. It's targeted support. Those who have got the means pay, those who don't can get support. So it's not universal, it's targeted, but I believe actually those who can afford to pay should pay. I think it's a good thing, but it's not universal. But I don't hear the SNP condemning those. So we don't have, not just now, we don't have the golden principle of universalism. It doesn't apply across the board. So for the SNP to claim that only they can defend universalism when they charge for many essential services, I think is a false debate, and it denies reality. So this social contract, this social wage, is really just some kind of fabricated construct. It's a kind of cover for a cobbled-together set of policies that they believe will appeal. And I do believe that they will appeal. That is certainly the case. But when we've got so many challenges in the world, is it right that we try and force the debate into that false construct? Universal good, targeted bad ignores, I think, the reality. Now, for me, I think we've got three big challenges, beyond getting the economy back on track. We've got poverty, age and the environment, the three big sustainability challenges that this country faces. And I think we need to focus our attention around these and others. I'm sure other people will have other priorities, but we should focus around the priority. What return we get for the investment that we make, rather than believing that universalism only is a good thing and everything else is bad. If you look at working population, it isn't growing as fast as we need it to grow in order to cope with the ageing population. We know that some communities have poverty that's so entrenched that people in those communities will be destined to remain in poverty unless we break that cycle. And if you look at climate change, we've already missed the first set of targets. We can't afford to miss more of those targets in future. Another priority that should be for this government. So although I accept freezing the council tax is a good thing in good times, does it really address climate change, demographic challenge or poverty? Does it really address fundamentally those issues? And that's why I think Gavin Brown is absolutely right. That's why I think Gavin Brown is absolutely right when he says that we do need those 10-year projections so that we can look forward into the future and see what the sustainability is of these policies and review them individually and collectively so that they are sustainable, so that they do address the big challenges that we face.
Could you begin to conclude, please?
On the climate change and on poverty. If we do not address those issues, if we don't look for a sustainable budget rather than a budget for the independence referendum, then I think we are letting this Parliament down and we are letting the country down. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Rennie, did you move your amendment?
Oh, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes, please, with a very little time in hand at the moment for interventions. I call Christina McKelvey to be followed by Siobhan McMahon. I would ask members who want to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This Scottish Government provides universal benefits and a decent living wage because we know that social justice, social cohesion and economic success depend on treating people fairly. My colleagues in the Welfare Reform Committee this week received some very interesting research. The study undertaken by the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University warns that welfare reforms alone will take more than £1.6 billion a year out of the Scottish economy. That equates to around £480 a year for every adult of working age in Scotland. In Glasgow, that amount rises to £650 a year. Down south, in the Cameron counties like Hampshire, Berkshire and Cambridge, people won't feel the same pinch. The impact there will be less than £200 a year. Hardly a testament to fairness. Presiding Officer, what happened to the idea of closing the gap between the rich and the poor? Certainly will.
Michael McMahon.
I thank the member for taking intervention. Will she also confirm that the report showed that in more prosperous parts of Scotland, the impact on the economy in those areas is comparable to areas that are prosperous in England? And it's not a geographical split between Scotland and England that was exposed by the report, but between those who are in the deprived areas of the UK and those in the more prosperous areas.
Christina McKelvey.
Yep. Absolutely, we didn't vote for, as Alec Neil has just said, we didn't vote for that. But it's really interesting, really interesting when you listen to the Labour Party in this debate. They would rather come to this chamber and come out with nonsense like that than actually be fighting austerity. And maybe that's because their own minister, or their own shadow minister, Liam Burn, said recently that if Labour win in 2015, they will not reverse austerity. He said that, I'm afraid, part of Ed Ball's zero-based spending review. Zero-based spending review, what does that mean? Zero for pensioners, zero for students, zero for the vulnerable, zero for the sick, zero for the unemployment. That's what Labour's got to offer Scotland, zero. So, Presiding Officer, what happened to the concept of lifting more and more children out of poverty? What happened to the belief in a fairer and more equal society? The concept of universality is the keystone of equality. George Orwell paraphrased his famous statement in Animal Farm: all men are created equal, but some are more equal than others. Well, for women, Presiding Officer, we are much more unequal. We live under an illusion that somehow the glass ceiling has been smashed and women are treated equally, but that is not the reality for women in Scotland. Women in Scotland are significantly lower paid than their male peers. In spite of equality legislation, they are still paid around 11.9% less than men doing the same job. This government is working hard to close that gap, but many of those reasons are beyond our reach as yet. It is women who take most of the responsibility for children, and most single-parent families are led by women. So it's no surprise that women are more likely than men to be living in poverty. And poverty is much more about not much more about the lack of income, but the lack of opportunity. Evidence showing that growing up in poverty can have a profound and lasting impact on children's outcomes. We have worked hard in Scotland to lift children out of poverty. Now the Cameron Coalition, supported by their Better Together buddies, want to reverse that success by withdrawing universal benefits like child benefit, the one payment a mother could count on getting herself. Westminster is consciously undermining the future for a generation of children born into poorer families, and those guys remain silent on it. We cannot continue to be powerless over decisions that concern the most disadvantaged people in our society. It is only independence that will allow us to make the best judgments for the people of Scotland within Scotland. Constituents, presiding officer, like yourself, are lining up at my door. Each one has a unique story to tell. Each is suffering because of decisions made by Westminster, consecutive governments of Westminster, and it completely fails to understand the Scottish environment. Universality lies at the centre of equality. Introducing hierarchies of means-tested and discretionary rules about a spare bedroom just reinforces that great divide. And who suffers most? The already disadvantaged, the lone parents, the children, the elderly, those who can't find work, the chronically ill and the disabled. David Cameron says he wants to make work pay, but is even attacking those who work with the support of disability living allowance. In the areas where we do have control, this government has put equality right at the heart of its agenda. We have healthcare that is free at the point of delivery, isn't threatened by continuing privatisation, and which is delivering a consistently better service to everyone in Scotland compared to the UK as a whole. Because we control that budget. We have free prescriptions universally because we know that these services help to keep people out of hospital. This government does not expect people to pay for being ill. We have free eye tests and free dental checks for children because we see the value of early intervention. And yes, we have control of that budget too. We have free education and no tuition fees at university because we control that budget. We have frozen council tax and made up to 10% reduction in council tax benefit made by David Cameron because we control that budget and it allows us to do it. We believe older people should be treated with dignity and respect and enabled to enjoy an independent old age. That's why we support universal free personal care for the elderly and the bus pass. Universal services shouldn't be a benefit. They should be a right, and an equal treatment should be given to all by all. It is with a yes vote, presiding officer, a yes vote alone, that will open up these choices, and that will allow the people of Scotland to create a fairer society. And I look forward to the day that we will be creating that fairer society, that just Scotland that we know is intrinsic to our values, Scottish values, and I support the Cabinet Secretary's motion.
Thank you. I now call Siobhan McMahon to be followed by Bob Doris.
We have improved social services, we are building hospitals, we are opening new schools. I remember they used to blame me for keeping back the schools to make way for new houses. It wasn't true even then, and it certainly isn't true now. On average, every week in this country, 10 new schools are opened. Our general economic prospects are good. Indeed, let's be frank about it, most of our people have never had it so good. And most of you will have realised that the person I have just referenced is Harold Macmillan, but you'll be forgiven for thinking it was John Swinney, such is the similarity of words used when discussing the provision of public services. Mr Swinney would like us to believe that things are great in communities across Scotland, that our education services are not crumbling under the pressure of a lack of resources, that our health service is not collapsing under the strain of financial constraint, and that we can continue to fund everything for everyone. Those of us in the real world know that that is not the case. And of course we know that Mr Swinney, when he is being honest with himself and his Cabinet colleagues, knows that too. During recess I have been reflecting on the subject of this debate and what universal services means to me. However, each time my thoughts have turned to the debate, I have been struck by how negative they are. Something for nothing, cuts commission, better together, are all the words that come to mind first. Of course, they aren't my words, and not something I would associate myself with. These are the words that the SNP members use to try to control this debate. Instead of stepping up to the challenge and working constructively to come up with an answer on how we fund universal services, the Scottish Government would rather use these negative words and phrases as their human shield and deflect attention from the real issues currently affecting people across the country. We all know that the current levels of public spending are unsustainable, and yet this government does nothing to help alleviate the problem. During a recent Finance Committee meeting, John Swinney said, "There is no lack of political leadership. The government could not be clearer about its views on how we should proceed." And yet everyone is still looking to him for the answer. If there was true political leadership on this issue, John Swinney would have come to the Chamber today and told us how this government will continue to fund universal services. We know that the current levels of public spending are unsustainable, that our country cannot afford to fund every service for everyone without raising money through increased taxation, yet the Scottish Government continue to spend money without being honest about the consequences. That's not showing political leadership. And let me be clear, I do not wish to take travel entitlement away from disabled people. I do not want to introduce £9,000 worth of tuition fees for students. I do not want to increase council tax by 30%, and I do not want people paying to use the local hospital. I cannot be clearer about that. However, I also don't want someone with a brain injury and who has epilepsy losing her entitlement to have a companion travel card because she's been told there isn't enough money to go around. I know that there is enough money to go around, it's just that the wrong decisions are being made with the money that's available. I don't want to see another local bus service lost because of a lack of investment in that sector. 136 bus services have been lost in Scotland since March 2011, meaning that those who rely on public transport are having to do without. That's not the society I want to live in. There is nothing fair about that. But that's just two examples of the real consequences if we do not address the issues of public spending. Now, I've heard many times in this chamber that the SNP have wiped student debt for Scottish students. I have to say it always puzzles me when that statement is said. I graduated in 2006 and as a result I pay the graduate endowment fee. I don't begrudge paying it, so it doesn't annoy me that my student debt hasn't been wiped, but it does annoy me that the members opposite say they have wiped all student debt, when of course that isn't the case. It annoys me that the Scottish Government has done nothing to address the student loan system in Scotland. As most members will know, student loans are awarded to students on the basis of their parent or guardian's income, not on the student's income. It doesn't take into account the number of dependencies your parent or guardian may have. It doesn't take into account if you as a student have a part-time job or not. It doesn't take into account the distance you have to travel. In my opinion, it would have been a far better idea to address student finance than to grandstand over an issue of wiping student debt for a select few. There is nothing fair about that. There is also nothing fair about parents opting to pay for their child to go to nursery school, to then pay for their child to go to primary and secondary school, and then expect the average taxpayer to pay for that same child to go to university. Again, this Government has done nothing to address this matter. Instead, they wipe that parent's financial obligations too. There is nothing fair about a council tax freeze. It is not fair that I have had my council tax frozen for yet another year when I can afford to pay more. I could contribute to making sure that vital local services continue, but of course my local authority weren't given that option. It is wrong that local authorities have their revenue generating power stripped from there year on year and then get the blame for reduced services. It is time the Scottish Government owned up to their role. Professor David Bell recently stated that if Scottish local authorities increased council tax at the same rate as those in England, they would generate approximately an additional £300 million by 2016-17. To maintain the council tax freeze, the Scottish Government will have to increase its compensation to local authorities for this lost income. In turn, this will increase the dependency of local authorities on Scottish Government funding. I don't believe that is political leadership in action. In fact, it is the complete opposite. I cannot support the Scottish Government paying £70 million of taxpayers' money to local authorities in order to ensure a council tax freeze, when I believe that this money would be better spent addressing the problems of bedroom tax in our local communities. But of course, the political leadership shown by the Scottish Government will not allow this. I hope that the Scottish Government will now look at the issue of public spending of universal services seriously and with urgency and take on board the genuine concerns we on these benches have regarding this matter.
Thank you. I now call Bob Doris to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to look at taxation in the UK and make a direct link to universal services. The current UK Government have courted much controversy by reducing the highest rate of income tax from 50% to 45%. That will benefit any UK taxpayer earning more than £150,000. For others earning over £32,000 a year, they will pay 40% tax on that income. Only 2 years ago, the 40% level was paid on £35,000, not in £32,000. And the 20% basic tax rate, as we know, as of next year will begin at £10,000. All these taxpayers and more, via tax measures such as VAT and various business taxes, pay for all the services that a state decides to spend money on. I think we should be clear on that. In Scotland, £12 billion, irrespective of how that gets its way via the block grant to Scotland, is part of £30 billion. £12 billion of that is spent on the NHS in Scotland, and within that, just £50 million is the cost spent ensuring that all in society are given free prescriptions, and I use the word free, of course, advisedly. Although, as we know, prescriptions are not free, of course, because the tax collected by a society pays for those prescriptions. So, what of the classroom teacher, perhaps, on between £21,400 or £34,000 in Scotland today, taxed at either 20% or 40% on their income? Don't they pay through taxation? Don't they pay already for prescriptions? What about MSPs in this chamber, actually, on £57,000 a year? Do we pay for prescriptions already in some way through general levels of taxation? If people want to have a debate about general levels of taxation, they should do that. But I don't believe you conflate it with fundamental universal service provision. And I think many in this chamber are in danger of doing that. So why do we insist that a teacher or a nurse, can I just develop this point first, Mr Smith? A teacher or a nurse or a firefighter or a police officer or indeed an MSP should pay more towards the NHS when they're ill, but not pay more towards the NHS when they're healthy. They already pay towards the NHS as a duty because they pay for taxation, and that is fundamental to me and why I believe that free prescriptions, I use the word free advisedly, are significantly important in a civilised, modern society where the NHS and medical provision should be free to everyone at the point of need. I think Mr Smith was coming in.
Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I think he is right, and it is interesting to have that debate about taxation and where the level of taxation would be. And I recall that at a panel on the subject of poverty in Glasgow not that long ago, he expressed his view that he would prefer that taxation rose. How does that square with the position of the Cabinet Secretary on the front bench today, who, as I understand his position, is that corporation tax in independent Scotland would fall and that personal taxation would not rise?
Bob Doris, and I can give you some time back.
Well, thank you very much. I think in corporation tax, the Cabinet Secretary has made it clear the strategy will be to increase the overall take in corporation tax. And as for sustainability, whether it's police reform, fire reform, pay constraint, preventative spend for the long term, or indeed whether it's the most recent GERS figure showing a £4 billion relative surplus, or that each of the last 30 years we have collected on an individual basis more per person in tax than anywhere else in the UK, shows that sustainability is indeed possible, Mr Smith. So can I have a look at prescription charges in some more detail? Abolished by an SNP government, benefiting 600,000 Scots on income of below £16,000 a year, I have to say. So abolishing prescription charges actually helped the most vulnerable in society. I also wanted, I'm just checking the time I have left, Presiding Officer, I always want to talk a little bit about the concessionary travel scheme. As Labour have said, they were keen to reintroduce prescription charges. They've also said they want to pick away at the universal concessionary travel scheme and take bus passes off some over 60s, but they won't say who. For many, I believe that is a lifeline, not just for household budgets, but also prevents social isolation. But what about the well-off pensioner? Because that argument's been made in this chamber a number of times. Why should they get a free bus pass? Well, I have to say that have pensioners, through the course of their lives, have they not paid taxes? You know, I have to say that. Also, I think we'll find that any pensioner who doesn't use the bus pass, it won't cost the state a penny, and I think that's important as well. I don't want a society, Presiding Officer, where the absolute poorest in society get free medicine at the point of need, but no one else. I don't want a society which divides our pensioners into the haves and the have-nots. I think that's divisive. I think it's corrosive. And ultimately, I think it undermines the social provision of services. And that's the real point I want people to take from this speech. I don't want Scotland to be somewhere where people pay taxes to the state and get little in return, as they might see it. Universal service provision benefits all in society. That is a social contract between government and communities. That's not a new concept, Mr Rennie. You know, no taxation without representation, I don't think was invented by the SNP, but there you go. We'll take credit for that as well if you want. I think that if we really want to have a society, which we currently do, where the Scottish people by and large feel it is a duty to pay tax for service provision, not just for the weakest in society, but for all in society. We have to preserve certain core universal services paid for all via general taxation. And that is the core of this debate today. And I think history will show that SNP and the Scottish Government are on the correct side of that debate.
Thank you very much. I now call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Christine Graham.
Presiding Officer, I listened with genuine interest, as I always do, to the Cabinet Secretary, because I was really wanting to know what this debate was really all about. But in fact, much of what we heard today from the Cabinet Secretary we've heard many times over in previous budget debates. So I think my initial view that the title of the debate, Universal Services, gave a clue, was in fact the reason why we were having the debate, because it does seem to me that the Scottish Government is trying to use the whole issue of universal services as a key issue in the weapon in the referendum battle, and not to put too fine a point upon it, to use that issue of universal services as a simple political football. And I think that's very regrettable, because we do need a proper debate about universal services, as Christie urged us to have and as the Independent Budget Review urged us to have. The Cabinet Secretary was very pleased to quote from those reports when it suited his purposes, but he was conveniently forgetting that part of their recommendations. Now, having said all that, of course I agreed with a great deal of what the Cabinet Secretary said today, and I agreed with a great deal of what Christina McKelvey said today, as I often do. But I would point out gently to Christina McKelvey that, in fact, the bulk of the problems being caused by the UK Government in terms of increasing poverty are not to do with the withdrawal of universal benefits, many of which, particularly for pensioners, are being maintained, but by the withdrawal of targeted benefits. If you think of the reductions in tax credits or indeed the housing benefit changes. And I think it's quite regrettable that the Cabinet Secretary, for example, in his whole speech didn't see fit even to mention the bedroom tax, because that obviously is one of the key issues in Scotland today, and perhaps a targeted approach to that would also be something that the Scottish Government could turn its attention to in terms of support for councils and housing associations who are losing money from that. The reality is that the debate is not about universal versus targeted benefits, it is about both. We have always used best. The Scottish Government knows this, and really a lot of the debate is about where we draw the line between the two. I thought the childcare example was very interesting that Willie Rennie gave, because if you think about it, Willie Rennie was actually adopting a far more universal approach, not a totally universal approach, but a far more universal approach to childcare than the Scottish Government, which in terms of the under-freeze is taking a very targeted approach. And I am not criticising that approach by the Scottish Government, because in the current financial circumstances that may well be the most effective way to deal with the early years. But I am merely pointing out that the Scottish Government in many policies does adopt a targeted approach. And we have to accept that it is totally simplistic and misleading to say that this debate is about universal services which they support, and other non-universal targeted services which, by implication, other parties support. I mean, I myself, over all my life in Parliament, have tended to support a more universal approach to childcare services on the Scandinavian model, but I thought it really interesting that, in fact, Alex Salmond came out with this particular view at the SNP conference a few weeks ago. But I think that speech also suggested something quite interesting to me, because what he was saying was, well, we could have those universal services if we have independence. And I think that is a lot of the mood, music and subplot of this debate. Indeed, the same Alex Salmond at an earlier SNP conference a few weeks ago said, I seem to recall, that the only way to protect universal services is to vote for independence. So in a kind of way, I think that is the real reason why we are having this debate. Again, since we have debated this matter on more than one occasion recently. I give way.
Mark MacDonald.
Mr Chisholm says that what he and his colleagues want to see is an open and honest debate. The Scottish Government is setting out its position within that debate by saying these are the services we believe are key, these are the services we believe we should fund. Wouldn't it be an open and honest debate if we were getting some indication from Mr Chisholm and his colleagues of which of those services they either support or indeed do not support, and what they would do differently?
Malcolm Chisholm.
They are right that the Scottish Labour Party should take time to look at those issues and the complexities of them, and also relate them to the financial situation. It is unreal to pretend that somehow you can have this debate without considering what the financial financial situation is. And that, of course, is the whole problem with the SNP approach, because they can present a distorted, simplistic, rosy picture of the economics of independence, and it's very easy for them to say that universal childcare will be possible under independence, and indeed any other universal service that they care to mention will be. And it's very difficult, because those are complex arguments. Well, I will do if I've got time, but I've only got 1 more minute, so well, I better now, actually, or I won't be allowed to. Okay.
I appreciate the member considers this debate is entirely around the issue of independence, but of course he says his party should take time to consider its position on these issues. But we are aware that his party's commission won't report till after the referendum. Is that a mere coincidence?
Malcolm Chisholm, I'll give you some time back.
My understanding is that they'll report long before that. But the thing is, we must have a serious debate about this. So it's perfectly reasonable to ask if a universal service such as concessionary travel should be modified. I'm not aware of anybody who's saying it should be abolished. If even Age Scotland say it should be starting at 65, surely the SNP can at least look at that view and not dismiss it as somehow some targeted betrayal. And it's also right to acknowledge that there's always been a difference between never-to-be-questioned universal services such as the NHS and some more recent additions. Well, I have some personal responsibility for one of those, free personal care, so I'm obviously attached to that, but I don't take the view that it should not be looked at in terms of whether that should be modified in some particular way. So I do think it is absolutely imperative that we have a serious debate about this. We take universal services out of the referendum battle and give it the proper, undivided attention that it deserves.
Thank you very much. I now call Christine Graham to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to bring some clarity on the UK's benefit spending by the Department of Work and Pensions. The total for 2011-12 was £166.98 billion. Of that, £74.22 billion was the state pension, not pension credit, but the state pension itself, 47% of that bill. Now, that to me is an entitlement. It's not a benefit. It's something that pensioners such as myself contributed to throughout their working life. So the perception somehow that the benefits bill, and in the rather obscene language of George Osborne, is the shirkers against the workers, is very wrong. In fact, of the rest of that bill from the DWP, much of it goes to people who are in work but are on low pay. So let's set that to the side. Let's also set to the side, as somebody who is a demographic challenge herself, the idea that pensioners are somehow just a burden. The pensioners are not all sitting at home with their carpet slippers on crocheting, and I'm talking about the men there, of course. Pensioners are not all a problem. They age range from 60 right up to 100. Pensioners provide free childcare to families who can go out to work. Pensioners are carers for their own elderly parents, saving the state money. Pensioners who work in B&Q and Tesco's and Asda pay taxes and incidentally also have the time to help you to buy the right things and don't rush your purchases through the conveyor belt. That's always a plus. Pensioners man voluntary sector desks, shops and collection tins, all contributing to society. So I don't want to hear any more somehow of pensioners are a burden. Many pensioners are a huge asset, both in what they give to society and they provide financially. Yes.
Liz Smith.
I think the member makes a very important and a very strong point. They do contribute very strongly. Nonetheless, would the member accept that when it comes to the percentage increase in the dependent population, what's been referred to in the Christie Commission and in the Beveridge report, is the size of that change that's a problem?
Christine Graham.
I'm coming to that. Obviously, there's a case for that, but it was to bring balance to the debate. So many of you are so young here, I feel you have the wrong idea about my generation and older generations. The most important thing, too, for this government is to set about what they call, this is their jargon, solidarity and cohesion. I thought for a minute Tommy Sheridan was coming back. It's not a new political party. But the purpose is to increase the overall income, particularly of those in the lower income groups, and cohesion, which is to get rid of the postcode lottery of poverty. Now, means testing to me doesn't help that. It doesn't help it in principle and it doesn't help it in practice, because in means testing there will always be winners and there will certainly be losers. Now, the reason I supported universality of pre-prescriptions was on the evidence. I chaired the Health Committee at the time, and the evidence was to us that some 95% plus were already not paying for prescriptions, so we're left with a small amount. There was what was called an exempt list of illnesses and diseases where people didn't pay. So we asked the professionals, how do we make that exempt list fairer? You can't. As soon as you add something to it, something else will come along. It was the professionals who told us, just get rid of prescription charges. Not only is it unfair, what you're left to administer is costly and not worth doing. For the rich person who probably pays for special treatment anyway, it won't matter, or they can put the money somewhere else. But the reality was it wasn't worth keeping it going for the reasons I've given. The universality of the concessionary bus pass I also support, again because there would be winners and there would be losers. Could I just finish my point? And you can come to the end of my bit about that. It is keeping people, as others have said, active, socially, physically and psychologically. In fact, GPs have indicated there have been huge health improvements on people who are able to travel about, who maybe can't afford to heat their houses. So get on the Edinburgh to Peebles bus, take a wee visit, keep warm, get a cup of tea and come home. It's a great plus in their lives. Now, you can have, if you're rich, a self-denying ordinance. You can say, well, I'm going to pay. Or you can put your money in a charity tin. To me, that's a far simpler way of dealing with it than trying to means test people, who, by the way, their means might change over time. So how often do you review it? But I do think there is merit. I'm just going to finish this bit. I think there's merit in what Malcolm Chisholm says about perhaps matching it to the changes in the retirement age. I think there is merit as the increase in the retirement age from UK is coming through. It may be appropriate not to take from people that have, but to sequence it in over a period of time. That seems to me something that pensioners would agree with too as being just. Now, as for, I don't know who wanted in. Do they still want in? Yes, okay.
Jamie Hepburn.
Oh.
She talked of a self-denying ordinance. Would she recommend to Siobhan McMahon that she operate a similar self-denying ordinance? She talks about being able to afford more for the council tax. Should you maybe be writing an additional cheque to a local authority?
Christine Graham.
I'm not going to personalise it, but I know that people in the chamber will contribute to various charities and things in different ways. So I think that that's a thing that can be done. I want to very quickly say in my last little bit of minutes about free personal care. This takes a huge stress out of people. And are we seriously saying that 77,000 vulnerable elderly people should not have assistance for personal care?
Order, please.
And in fact, what has been shown is that Age UK have shown that it costs £5,000 if you're going to have an argument.
Order, please.
Jackets outside. £5,000 to keep somebody at home with care. It costs £25,000 to put them into a care home. And on a final point, when we introduced it was one of the best things this Parliament did, and I was here at the time when they did it. We introduced it and we lost attendance allowance, and I remember members of the Labour Party, I remember Henry McLeish, and I remember various people on the Labour benches trying to get that attendance allowance back. I have discovered that at the current figure, we have lost over this period from 2002 to 2011, £270 million has been retained by the DWP. Now, if we're talking about justice, that money should have come back to Scotland.
Thank you very much, and can I ask members not to conduct debates with each other across the chamber? I call Willie Coffey to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thanks very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by taking us back to 1972, to the speech given by Jimmy Reid at the inauguration as Rector of Glasgow University, described by the New York Times as the greatest speech since the Gettysburg Address. Jimmy's speech was entitled Alienation. It described a society with its prevailing sense of values that caused people to become alienated from humanity, to be partially dehumanised, that made them insensitive and ruthless in their handling of their fellow citizens, becoming self-centred and grasping individuals. He talked about a rat race, the scurrying around, trampling on others in the pursuit of personal success, and pleaded with the students of the time to reject this, as it led to the loss of dignity and the human spirit. He said it was a tragedy that the great mass of people go through their lives without a glimmer of what they might have contributed to their fellow human beings. But through education, the flowering of individual talents was the precondition for everyone's development. Today, Presiding Officer, I think we're seeing a new version of alienation, when we see people who need the help of their fellow man being demonised by some sections in our society. Essentially, this is a big part of what today's debate is about, the kind of society we want and a choice of futures. There's nothing in the opposition's amendments that we can rally round and offer up as an exciting alternative package to the Scottish people. Labour's amendment is a threat to abolish universal services, thinly disguised as a concern about sustainability. The Tory amendment wants a 10 or even 20-year budget forecast, and the Liberal amendment simply welcomes the Tory budget that they signed up to. All pretty depressing in their lack of vision for Scotland. So, do we go along with the divisive, means-testing, something-for-nothing brigade, which was Joanne Lamont's words, it wasn't the SNP's words? Or do we face it down and deliver a better future for our people? The four pillars behind our public service reforms, prevention, performance, people and partnerships, are key drivers in helping us to deliver the outcomes that the Scottish people want. They help us to intervene early, to prevent problems occurring and ultimately offer better value. They've allowed us to focus on performance improvement within our police and fire services and to establish close partnerships amongst our councils in respect of the integration of health and social care. The Scottish Government is delivering a better future now for the people of Scotland. The 5 universal services of not charging our university students for their tuition fees, not charging the sick for their prescriptions, not charging our elderly citizens for their personal care needs, not charging for eye tests and not charging our senior citizens for their bus travel are not the mark of a profligate government being reckless with the public finances. The figures show that even with these commitments, public spending in Scotland in each of the last 5 years is still less than in the UK as a percentage share of our economy, by some £4 billion. It is even lower than the majority of our European Union partners. These services, affordable and fully paid for, are the mark of a government that recognises, as Jimmy Reid's foundation does, that the principle of universality is one of the greatest achievements of this Parliament. Over 100,000 students in Scotland benefit each year from our decision not to charge tuition fees. Student debt levels are by far the lowest in the UK. We abolished Labour's endowment fees, and our students from the poorest backgrounds get a minimum income of over £7,000. This isn't something for nothing. This is investment to allow individual talents to flourish for everyone's benefit. We already know that in Scotland... Yes, sure.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I ask Mr Coffey to explain why, on head count, the number of students in further education has dropped from just under 500,000 in 2007 to 320,000 today?
Willie Coffey.
Of course it hasn't, and I think, because I've mentioned Jimmy Reid, I think he would be hard pushed to determine and find out who the Tories are in this chamber, I think, these days, Mr McIntosh.
Order, please.
We already know, Presiding Officer, that in Scotland 600,000 adults who earned less than £16,000 a year were not previously entitled to free prescriptions. Studies carried out in 2008 in 15 high-income countries that did have prescription charges for medicines showed that it led patients to forgo the use of essential drugs, with a consequential impact on their health and higher care costs as a result. That's not something for nothing. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Jimmy Reid at the time urged Glasgow University students to reject the attitudes that might set one group against another and to reaffirm their belief in faith and humanity, to unashamedly acknowledge, as Burns put it, that man is good by nature, and he stated his belief that his generation was taking mankind along this path towards a goal that is worth fighting for. Just over 40 years on from that speech, I think the vision for Scotland set out by the Scottish Government embraces those goals so wonderfully expressed by Jimmy Reid. I too think that they are worth fighting for, and look forward to continuing this process in an independent Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Liz Smith to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think this is a good debate to take place, and while I understand that it's got some added impetus because of the referendum debate, I think it's an important debate in any context, because it ought to be about political long-term thinking, and very definitely not about any hint of political opportunism. It's a debate about for which services the state should and should not be responsible, and therefore about the extent of the burden we expect our taxpayers to bear. The Cabinet Secretary said in his opening remarks how important the Christie Commission was in making him think about the longer term, and that's absolutely true, because I think together with the Beveridge report, plus all the utterances that we've had from the business community and civic communities across Scotland, they have warned persistently that the current situation of universal benefit payments is not sustainable unless there is either an increase in the overall tax receipts in Scotland or significant reductions in some other areas of public spending. And of course this all comes at a time where there is debate about the size of Scotland's public sector. Now, of course, it would be very nice. All of us would sign up to a policy, if we were in a utopia, where we could have everything free. I'm sure we'd all love to be part of a government whose beneficence can stretch ahead indefinitely to provide us all with free bus passes, free prescriptions, free university education, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that that is simply, under the current circumstances, not responsible government. This debate needs to take on board a moral and philosophical dimension which pays heed to the meaning of social justice, equality of opportunity and public responsibility. The very yes, of course.
Derek Mackay.
In terms of that moral,
could we have the Minister's microphone, please? Thank you.
Would the member, in view of that moral and philosophical outlook, like to give us a view, therefore, on the fact that UK government's reducing the rate of tax for the richest, whilst other governments are having to make very challenging decisions?
Liz Smith.
Yes, absolutely I would, because this is all part of the balance that is required. There is a moral perspective to be looked at on this, because it is about the founding principles of the welfare state, but they have to be set against what provides the incentive for individuals and families and the incentive to work. And these are controversial. We know that. We know that by the controversy that we have just now, and it's certainly by no means the first controversy that we've had on this issue. And I think both Malcolm Chisholm and Willie Rennie have made very important speeches in this. It is about choices. It's about the value judgments that we have to make. And we will come to different responses on that. But it is not right to say that these choices are not there, because they very definitely are. And I think when it comes to the economic challenge, it is about the allocative efficiency. Is the economy getting the best out of what are very scarce resources, set against all the usual arguments that we have of Pareto optimality and what goods we ought to have? And I'm sure these issues fascinate economists, and they also trouble politicians. But there is no doubting that they come more into play when the percentage share of the dependent population — I totally accept what Christine Graham was saying about the very positive contribution that can be made from older people — but it needs to be set against the statistics that Gavin Brown spoke about in his speech. And we cannot accept that there isn't a major decision to be made on that basis. For us, as Conservatives, there is a balance to be struck. Universal benefits in our book can only be argued for if there is an overriding and definitive proof that by making them universal, all the individuals and society and the economy in general are better off as a result. May I just finish this point, and I'll come back to that, because I think something like the provision of health visitors is an example of something that we see is as a universal benefit. And we put this through in our budget recommendations, and we also made a point of it which was accepted in this Parliament just a few months ago. I think it's why the Parliament voted for that, because there is overriding and definitive proof that that kind of level of spending at that level is something that provides youngsters with that universal benefit, irrespective of who they are.
Christine Graham.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. It's simply, do you accept that the concessionary travel scheme is a great contributor to preventative deterioration in elder people in all kinds of ways, and that is of great use and should be retained?
Liz Smith.
Yes, I do for some, but I think it is this point about the debate about universal payments and which we should have as universal. I think Willie Rennie hit on this point too. It's not just about yes or no. It's about ensuring, and I come back to the point about using the best possible line on our economic resources that we have. I think there are choices to be made. And where we differ with other parties in this chamber, for example, on higher education, is because we believe that there are private benefits as well as public benefits to be gained from that. And where we argued on the question of free school meals, and I think most of that debate was in 2008, is because we believed that, I think it was something in the region of 118,000 extra children were going to benefit from that policy, but many of them would have benefited from it in any case, so that money would have been better spent in other areas. So I think we have to be careful about saying it's an either-or. I think there is a measured debate to be had on this. Deputy Presiding Officer, I just want to say, to sum up, that I think this is a very important debate. I think it's incumbent upon all of us, just as Mr Brown said, to set out not only our policies, but how we would cost them, and more importantly, where that money is coming from. I support the amendment in the name of Mr Brown.
Thank you very much. I now have to tell the Chamber that unfortunately we've run out of the spare time, so interventions will have to be accommodated within the 6 minutes from now on. Claire Adamson, to be followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate today is about the discussion about what kind of society we want to have and what our values are in terms of where we want our welfare system. And there is no doubt that Scotland wants a welfare system that is built on the principle of universalism, from each according to the ability and to each according to need, and from the cradle to the grave. Scotland has consistently voted for this. I have spoken about universalism in this chamber before, and I make no apology for returning to some of the points I raised at that time. Indeed, in response to Joanne Lamont's speech in which she introduced the concept of the Something for Nothing Society, the Jimmy Reid Foundation published a report on the case for universalism, and indeed I tabled a motion in the Parliament on the 4th of December last year, hoping for a debate at that time, but not surprisingly none of the parties who have tabled amendments to the motion today signed up to that, so we were unable to have the debate at that time. But the motion looked at the evidence and impact of the universal public services, and the report highlights and understands overriding conclusions in it that the group that will be most affected if universalism is rolled back are poor people. The report also moves to show that universalism is targeted services creates in society stigma. It reduces take-up rates considerably, especially we can see that in the case of the elderly. It causes enormous increase in administration costs and leads to less public support for those services in terms of their quality and the need for them within our society, which in turn leads to significant decline in the quality of those services. This is a really important report on the case for universalism. And I also return to remind the Chamber of the Scottish Futures Forum, which was held in this Chamber on the 29th of May in 2009, which looked at reducing inequality in our society. And some of the key themes that came out of that were that inequalities of income and wealth have changed little in recent decades, with a corrosive effect on all sections of society. It is therefore vital that we tackle inequality as much as poverty. And whether we look to books like The Spirit Level or other evidence, there is absolutely no doubt that societies which are less unequal, and not forgetting we are the most unequal society in Europe, the fourth most unequal in the world, that the societies that are less unequal fare far better. We often make comparisons to the Nordic countries, and there is absolutely no doubt that individually and collectively they occupy the highest ranks and indices of income, wealth, happiness, life satisfaction and equality, with the lowest levels of poverty and inequality. These societies are based on the fundamental principles of universal welfare, and they are hugely important. I would like to develop that argument a little by quoting from this month's New Scientist. The editorial in the New Scientist talks about the true cost of cuts, and I know Mr Brown asked John Swinney for a 10-year projection of what the universal benefits will cost. But as a member of the Conservative Party, the party who is introducing austerity, he might want to consider when they will give us figures about the true costs of austerity. The editorial says that the immediate consequences of austerity may give way to more enduring and insidious effects on our health. It is plausible that protracted economic hardship will lead to increases in heart attacks, strokes and depression. Stress hormones are known to trigger and exacerbate these conditions, and it is hard to argue that those worrying about the security of their jobs, homes, families and finances are not experiencing high levels of stress. It also goes on to say the effects on health, on the other hand, have gone largely undiscussed. The assumption is that when the austerity leaves and the belt tightening goes away in our society, that these health problems will not still exist, but it's a genetic transformation for people who are affected by this. Sometimes a genetic influence on them before they're even born, while they're still in the womb, because of the stress hormones in their mothers at times of austerity. And the New Scientist also, in their article within the journal, The Austerity's Toxic Genetic Legacy, quotes from the Lancet. It says the more immediate health impacts of economic cuts were documented in last month's Lancet, revealing that suicides in Europe have soared since the financial crash in 2008, with 1,000 extra deaths in England alone by 2010. Likewise, the incidence of mental health disorders and increased in countries worst hit by the debt crisis, such as Greece and Spain. And the article also has a quote from David Strickler from the University of Oxford. And this is where I bring in the Nordic comparison again. He says that the paths chosen by Iceland, Finland and Sweden may demonstrate a healthier way of dealing with an economic crisis. Unlike many other countries, their governments decided to let the banks fail post-2008 rather than bailing them out. They then nationalised all of them, restricting the bank's risky investment activities. They also retained all health and welfare budgets as opposed to cutting them back, and introduced schemes to detain and redeploy sacked workers. These measures insulated the population from many of the stresses of austerity, possibly explaining why rates of suicide and mental health problems have not risen. There is absolutely no doubt that this is about choices, but the choices can be made better for Scotland.
Thank you very much. I now call James Kelly and Mark MacDonald and remind members they must keep to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I was interested in the reluctance of the Cabinet Secretary to engage in 10-year projections, and it might to many seem surprising that such an experienced politician didn't want all the data before him in order to assess the potential policy options going forward. But I suppose if you look at the landscape that faces Mr Swinney and the Scottish Government, they do see that there are £3 billion cuts coming down the line in the next 4 years from the UK Government. And the Christie Commission tells us that it will be 16 years to 2026 before expenditure returns to the level of 2010. In addition to that, those aged 65 or over will increase by 62% by 2013. And all these factors mean that there will be a real terms increase in the cost of providing public services. Of course, Mr Swinney is aware of these facts. He maybe acknowledges them in private, but not in public. And perhaps, what makes him uneasy about that is the upcoming independence referendum. And we know that because of the famous Swinney dossier, the declaration of St Andrew's House, because that told us that the Scottish budget would be more volatile under independence, that an independent Scotland would start life saddled with debt. Perhaps as much. Well, it's interesting you should say that, Mr Stevenson, but we heard yesterday the fairy tale figure. Mr MacDonald.
Mark MacDonald.
Is it the member's contention that Scotland is currently not saddled with debt as part of the United Kingdom?
Ms Kelly.
Well, Mr MacDonald, I was just going on to talk about the fairy tale debt figures announced yesterday by the Deputy First Minister. Yeah, let me come.
Order.
I'm just coming. On you go, Mr Swinney. Right.
John Swinney.
I think it would be really important for Mr Kelly to give Mr MacDonald an answer to his question. Is Scotland saddled with debt as part of the United Kingdom? Yes or no? It's a very simple question, Mr Kelly. Let's hear the answer.
James Kelly.
And the point I was going on to make, Mr Swinney, is see when you look at the level of debt that you would start up with in an independent Scotland, don't start with fairy tale figures. Include the figures involved in rescuing the bank bailout in 2008. Fifth, on you go.
John Swinney.
I think we'll have Mr Kelly on the unionist negotiating team on this one. Does Mr Kelly not realise that the cost of bank bailouts is all included in the debt figures of the United Kingdom and all included in the debt figures that we were projecting about in terms of the publications that we've made?
James Kelly, 2 minutes 45 seconds.
The point is, Mr Swinney, as you remind us every year, you've only got a fixed budget of £30 billion and it took £57 billion to rescue the Scottish banks alone. More than double the level of the Scottish budget.
Order, please.
So how would you have saved those banks in an independent Scotland? That's the answer. That's the answer that the SNP have got to give to those account holders, to the thousands of people with mortgages in those banks and those supported by jobs.
Order!
You know, it's time we actually had some honesty in this debate. You know, because we heard Siobhan McMahon quite correctly describing the effects of the cuts in bus services. The fact that we now have subsidised bus miles at a 10-year low. And that has resulted in 136 bus routes less than we had last year. It's all very well members like Christine Graham talking up the benefits of the bus pass, but if you're a pensioner, as has happened in my constituency in Halfway and Cambuslang, and they take off the bus route that runs through your area, then what good does your bus pass then serve if you don't have the bus routes? And that's the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. It's time for some honest discussion. When are we going to see some honest men and women in the SNP stand up and face the reality? I sometimes wonder that people like Mr Stevenson, when they go back to their constituency at the weekend, they put on a blindfold. They don't actually see what's happening on the ground. Because if he came to my constituency, he would see that there are over 3,000 children on or below the poverty line. That many of those 120,000 students who are on the waiting list and can't get a college place are in my constituency. It's time to open your eyes and face up to the debate. If we want the public to respect us, summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, if we want the public to respect us as a Parliament, we need to be honest about what's happening on the ground. We need to be honest about the finances, and we need a debate about our priorities, and we need to put fairness first.
Many thanks. I now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Graham Pearson. An exact 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Well, I didn't quite anticipate when I intervened on Mr Kelly with what I assumed was a very simple question about whether or not Scotland was saddled with debt within the UK, that it would quite go down the trajectory that it did. And for Mr Kelly to speak on the one hand about fairy tales and then talk about the bank bailouts in the terms that he did, I think demonstrates quite clearly why I'll not be taking any lessons from Mr Kelly around the economics of Scotland, either in the here and now or under independence. But it was interesting to listen to some of the rhetoric that has come forward in this debate. And Siobhan McMahon said that it's the SNP who have brought the term something for nothing into this debate. We have brought the term something for nothing into the debate, and we are using the term something for nothing. Well, we are indeed using the term something for nothing because it's what is commonly called in the trade as a direct quotation from Joanne Lamont's speech of the 25th of September, where she said Scotland cannot be the only something for nothing country in the world. So it was the Labour Party which introduced the term into the debate, so please forgive us if we continue to use it to remind people of what it is the Labour Party thinks universal services are all about. Now, in some respects, Willie Rennie was correct. I note he's not here for that rare occasion when somebody says it in the chamber. But when he spoke about the fact that this debate was about priorities, Presiding Officer, and I accept that it is about priorities. It's about stating what are the priorities that you want to see within a fixed budget that the Scottish Government is currently dealing with. And I accept the sincerity with which Willie Rennie pursues the childcare issue as an agenda. It's something that he clearly feels passionately about. It's an issue on which we have a disagreement because we feel that the priorities lie elsewhere. But at the same time, his argument is somewhat fundamentally undermined by the fact that the government which his party supports at Westminster is pursuing benefit changes at present which will see £1 billion worth of cuts to benefits directly affecting children in Scotland. So on the one hand, he can talk about provision of childcare for 2-year-olds in Scotland, while I see Mr Brown leaping to the defence of his UK coalition colleague, and I will allow him to put forward the argument on Mr Rennie's behalf.
Gavin Brown.
Purely in the interest of accuracy, will the benefits budget next financial year go up or down?
Mark MacDonald.
The point that Mr Brown misses, and the point that Mr Brown always misses, is the impact that that budget has in terms of the fact that it is changed to CPI, in terms of the fact that it does not take into account some of the changes that are taking place within the economy, and it offsets completely the tax changes that he has trumpeted in this chamber. Those are the points that he fails to understand and always fails to take into account. And I note Mr Brown was receiving some support for his remarks from the Labour benches there, which I thought was remarkable, because I would have thought of all the people who would have joined in condemning the benefits approach being taken by the UK Government, the Labour benches would be among them, but apparently not. In terms of the issue around social cohesion, and this is an important point that a number of my colleagues have made, and it's why it is important to look at universal benefits as being part of the social fabric. The point was made in evidence given to the Health Committee in a written submission by Dr Jerry McCartney, the head of the Public Health Observatory Division at NHS Health Scotland, and he said there are numerous dangers with a policy approach which reduces universal provision of services, for example, means testing, prescription charges, school meals, dentistry and pensions, as this undermines the collectivism which supports taxation to pay for these services, increases stigma for those who use the services, and results in reduced investment and reduced service quality. Now, the point there is that we believe that those who are paying into the pot, often at a higher rate, should be entitled to receive something back at the end of that, or indeed through the process. The point around prescriptions, and it's often said, and I've been receiving missives from Labour councillors on Twitter saying that we're giving free prescriptions to rich people. No, we're giving free prescriptions to sick people, and there is a difference. Illness doesn't take account of your income when it hits you, therefore you should be entitled to the same rights as anybody else who is struck by illness. But the point about stigma is an important one as well, Presiding Officer. Because if two people are in the chemist receiving their prescriptions and one has to pay at the counter and the other one does not, that immediately tells them that one of them is on a low income and the other one is not. It creates a stigma for the person who is receiving the free prescription because they feel it marks them out as somebody who requires the help of the state rather than somebody who is entitled to the help of the state, and that's an important distinction. On the affordability issue, I have to laugh at the juxtaposition on the Labour benches, because on the one hand they wave around the not-so-secret document and say things from it that are already in the public domain anyway, and Mr McIntosh says they're looking at the affordability of pensions as if that was a bad thing for a government to do, and then they tell us it's a good thing that the Labour Party is looking at the affordability of universal services. So on the one hand, it's bad for the Scottish Government to look at the affordability of pensions. On the other, it's a really good thing that Labour are looking at the affordability of universal services. No. I'm sorry, I've only got 30 seconds left, Mr.
Members in his last minute.
If you can pass it to Ms Dugdale for her summing up. And on the point, Presiding Officer, but if affordability is bad in terms of pensions, then Mr McIntosh must also accept it being bad in terms of universal services. If it's good for universal services, surely it's also good to be looking at affordability for pensions. And finally, Presiding Officer, we have an indication of at least one area where the Labour Party thinks that universality should be continued, because Kezia Dugdale, who will be summing up for the Labour Party, said on Colkey on the 26th of September, the day after the Something for Nothing speech, I think that probably free prescription charges would need to stay. And she can tell us in the summing up if she agrees with herself.
Many thanks. Now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by James Dornan. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The previous member indicated that it was a good thing that the Cabinet Secretary was analysing the affordability of pensions. And that, in our view, indicates his concerns about whether or not budgets can support pensions for the future and what plans need to be made in order to ensure that that economic environment can deliver. Why, therefore, is it not sensible that we should also look at the affordability of the various services that are currently provided from public budget and decide on whether or not the provision of these services can be paid for? When the topic for this debate was first announced, I was concerned it had been tabled by the Scottish Government in order to give SNP members the opportunity to claim that their party was the champion of universal services and put forward scaremongering claims that opposition parties wanted to remove services from vulnerable people and erode the provision of the welfare state. Unfortunately, my concerns have proved justified. John Swinney has acknowledged his budget finances are challenged. I would remind him those challenges are being faced across the Western world, not solely here and, as he says, south of the border. In addition, Robert Black, the former Auditor-General for Scotland, indicated people think it's been tough up until now, but there are still two-thirds of the spending cuts still to be made between now and 2014. The moves being made by the Labour Party in Scotland to actually at least start asking questions, I think, is a good thing. Until he made that statement, I think Robert Black was lauded in this very chamber as being a man of common sense and of some vision for the future. And we have to be honest with the people of Scotland. Universal services are an ideal to which we aspire. But in this new world, we also have to take into account affordability and necessity. I believe that a combination of universal and targeted benefits offers the best way forward for Scotland and provides the best support for our most vulnerable. If we look past the promises that are currently being made, there is a gulf between government promises and the actions and the words. In justice, for instance, whilst the SNP promised 1,000 extra police officers, they actually allowed a cut of 977 police staff since 2010, meaning without doubt that some recruits will have to take off the front line to do backroom jobs. At the same time, the Government is refusing to guarantee the future of local police stations. They are attempting to close a number of local courts, and we are hearing conflicting statements regarding police officers' terms and conditions. For our part, Scottish Labour did increase the number of police officers by 1,500, tackled antisocial behaviour and began the seizing of criminal assets and investing those assets in areas hardest hit in serious violent crime, and spent £10 million on CCTV cameras to make Scotland's streets safer. I understand well as anyone that times are tough and economic climates will have impact on public services, but I can't tolerate a government misleading people in Scotland and being dishonest with the electorate. The recent changes in legal aid provision demonstrates the contradictory commitment to universal services. The SNP universal provision now means that a citizen with disposable income of more than £82 a week or capital of more than £750 must contribute towards the cost of their defence. These proposals led to lawyers boycotting and protesting, warning that innocent accused people could be incentivised to plead guilty. But while an individual accused of their first offence could now be required to pay, figures show that in the period 2009 to 2012, more than 6,500 people received more than 10 grants of legal aid, and well over 100 people received more than 30 grants. There has to be a balance between providing legal aid for those who require it most and measures in place to ensure that repeat offenders don't abuse the system. I think the hypocrisy of universal services is most clearly demonstrated by a case of one of my constituents, an SNP health service repeatedly described as free at the point of use. My constituent suffers from bowel cancer, and only the drug doctors have found that will have a positive impact on her disease is cetuximab, a drug available to patients in the rest of the UK and in some parts of Scotland. As a result of the current delivery of universal services, however, she and her family have had to pay £800 per treatment in order to deal with her ailment. Her case makes a mockery of the claim that healthcare in Scotland is universal, free and at the point of use, and shows how much a postcode lottery it has become. It also clearly demonstrates the gulf between government promise and what is actually delivered. The Finance Secretary acknowledges he has made choices in his budget. My constituent and many like her face the results of those choices, and the Government would much prefer to give Fred Goodwin and his like free travel at the cost of my constituent. This debate is about fairness. We need to support those who count on our support. Dispensing largesse carelessly.
That's enough, Mr Pearson. Thank you. Now call on James Dornan to be followed by Duncan McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I go on to say what I was going to say initially, I'd like to speak about the last speaker. He talked about fear and scaremongering by the SNP. He then goes on to say, yeah, you say you brought in 1,000 extra police, but you've sacked 1,000 extra police staff, and alluding to the fact that all these police officers are now behind the desk. I spoke to a number of fairly senior police officers over the last few months, and not one of them has told me that police officers are working behind desks. And as a matter of fact, they've told me it would be illegal to replace somebody who'd just been paid off by a police officer doing the same job. And the reason why they can do with less staff, which is always unfortunate, is because of modernisation of the services. Most of these, I think, you'll find have happened in Strathclyde, and I suspect the same modernisation programme will now be taken across the rest of the country. You also continually go on about what's coming down the track. And you're right, what's coming down the track is terrible. Made in Westminster, continued in Westminster, and what you're suggesting is that we hold on to Westminster. The only solution you're not willing to look at is a solution of giving us the powers to control the finances, to control the tax and to control the welfare benefit system for the people of Scotland. I think that universal benefits which go across our society are an important bedrock of our society. Presiding Officer, these words of wisdom are not mine. They are the words of the leader of the UK Labour Party, Ed Miliband, in an interview in the Andrew Marr show earlier this year, and he's absolutely right. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be a view shared by the leader of the Labour group in the Scottish Parliament, Joanne Lamont, who appears to believe it's time to get rid of these universal services that are, in my opinion, crucial to our vision of a just and fair society. Now, some people agree with Ms Lamont about the sustainability of universal services. According to one commentator, there is now, quote, a consensus around cutting universal benefits because they are not sustainable. Unfortunately for Ms Lamont and the Labour Party in Scotland, this cheerleader for their views is Peter Hoskin, an associate editor of the centre-right blog Conservative Home. Now, I'm not going to spend my speech going over the Scottish Government's record on universal services. We've already heard a lot about the free tuition, bus passes, free elderly care and free prescriptions. But instead I want to focus on the impact that these services have and why both Peter Hoskin and Joanne Lamont and her colleagues are wrong in wishing to see them end. Presiding Officer, like many others, I represent a constituency of huge diversity. In Cathcart, we've got the suburb of Newlands, the picturesque Cathcart village and Carmonach, and of course there are areas beset with real problems of poverty and deprivation, including parts of Castlemilk, Kennishead and Carnrodrick, which border Joanne Lamont's own constituency. But it's also important to recognise there are a number of areas in my constituency filled with households just making ends meet. They are neither impoverished nor particularly well off, but they have enough money to pay the bills with some disposable income left over, and many of them will be hugely affected by the abolition of universal services envisaged by both the Tories and Scottish Labour. I recently met with young people from high schools in Castlemilk who have the ambition to go on to university and get a degree. For many, they will be the first in their families or of their friends to go to university. Imagine what we do to that aspiration, that desire to learn, to live independently, perhaps travel abroad, get a qualification and get a good job. If I was to go back to their school and tell them that they would have to pay thousands of pounds for their education, either up front or through the back door. Joanne Lamont once taught in Castlemilk, and dare I say it, she knows just how disappointed and disillusioned they would be, just confirming once again their belief that university is not for the like of them. Or what about the elderly couple, both of them worked their entire life paying into the system and now looking to enjoy their retirement? They don't have a huge pension, but their bus pass and the fact that they don't have to worry about prescription bills certainly helps them to get about. In no way can we accuse them of having something for nothing, as has been so crassly put. Now, it may be claimed that these are not the people that Joanne Lamont was referring to. Instead, she was referring to people with an income, the like of Fred Goodwin, who, as usual, we've just heard about, but funnily enough, we never heard he was made a Sir by the Labour Party. But seriously, around 1% of people in Scotland earn 100k or more, and how many of them are queuing up to get a bus pass? I don't earn anything like that. I earn a very good salary. I'm very fortunate, and I know, looking at me, you won't believe it, but I was 60 the other week, and the one thing I refused to do when I became 60 was apply for my bus pass. And I suspect that most people will be doing exactly the same. And it's not the top 1% of income earners who will suffer under Joanne Lamont's plan. No, it will be families from across my constituency, people who, along with constituents across the breadth of the city of Glasgow, work hard, pay their bills, but have very little excess income. Is Ms Lamont really suggesting that they deserve to be penalised for having a little put by to help their sons and daughters go to university, to be able to pay for that wee holiday, which they can now afford because of the free travel, and to live pain-free because they don't have to decide what medicines they can afford to pay for? Yes, have some disposable income at the end of the month, but they're not these millionaires we hear about all the time from those who wish to make political capital out of people's fears. And the really depressing thing about this is that even if we went down the route that the Labour Party and their colleagues are suggesting, it wouldn't save us any money. If you look at the Fabian report, there's a report of 2010, there's a report by Walter Corpay and Joachim Palm from 1998 called The Paradox of Redistribution. The more we target benefits of the poor only, the less likely we are to reduce poverty and inequality. And it also goes on to say that the less likely we are to save money. So, for economic reasons, it doesn't work. For the reasons of sustainability of society, it doesn't work. For the reasons of common humanity, it was already touched on by some of your colleagues about the fact that you don't want to be stigmatising people. Nobody in this chamber should be going down that route. I ask you to support the motion for the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Well done. Many thanks. Now Colin Duncan McNeill to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Presiding
Officer.
I agree with Malcolm Chisholm earlier when he said he was puzzled by the nature of the debate. I think we've had a flat performance from the Cabinet Secretary in his opening, confirming, I suppose, his embarrassing situation he now finds himself in, forced publicly to deny the views that he has argued in private. Whatever happened to this modernising Cabinet Secretary in the heady days of the historic Concordat, the single outcome agreements, outcome-focused policy decisions, shared services across the public sector, the integration of public services, and of course he brought about the independent budget review, which were all radical at that time, preparing us for change that needed to take place. And this was in 2010. Crawford Beveridge, the man who described our financial situation in the public sector as the biggest since the Second World War. Now, John Swinney, of course, has distanced himself from Crawford Beveridge today. But in 2010, he went on tour with Crawford Beveridge. He was so enthused by his report and what it found that he went on tour. He was in public. You were in public tour with him. Took public meetings with him. I could recall one distinctly that was reported to my committee at that time, which was in Livingston the night before you gave evidence to the committee. You were in tour with him. Now, if Crawford Beveridge was used to provide, and I'm not saying you were wrong, I'm saying you were right. And if Crawford Beveridge provided that economic imperative for action, then of course Campbell-Christie review was to provide the moral imperative, and the message from Christie could not be any clearer. Alongside a decade of growth in public spending, inequalities have grown too, between the highest and the lowest achievers at school, between life expectancy and the health of the richest and the poorest, and between the static wages of the lowest paid and the booming bonuses of the highest. Our public services have somehow failed to make our country fairer. That was what you were presented with at that time. In hard times, we have a bigger responsibility that I would argue that you are now shirking. A bigger responsibility to get this right. Yes, I'll take your intervention.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr McNeill for giving way. This contribution, I think, would be assisted if Mr McNeill would perhaps spend a moment reflecting on the recommendations of the independent budget review that I have accepted and implemented with my reforming zeal, and the recommendations of the Christie Commission that I have accepted and implemented with my reforming zeal, rather than parroting this rubbish about no progress on these independent reports.
You may puff yourself up as a peacock in here, but we know you're the chicken. We know you're the chicken in Cabinet that's not prepared to fight for what is right. In hard times, we have a bigger responsibility as politicians to get this right. That is the cause. That is the cause. This is serious stuff. That is the cause, because there is a price being paid by people across the country for your failure to act, and you will be held to account for that. This is a cause that motivates us on this side of the chamber. We want, like others here, a fairer Scotland that shares the burden. Those of us who value public service cannot stand back, cannot allow the quality of those services to diminish. At the time of disinvestment, it's even more important to plan that disinvestment. If only we had indeed a Cabinet Secretary that was prepared to act, and act on what he really believes in. As the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has said, to secure social justice and sustainable economic growth, the real test will be achieving fairness in the midst of cuts. Deciding how to cut spending. That's my writing. I can't read my own writing. Yes, I'll take it.
I'm interested as to where Mr McNeill's line would sit. Does Mr McNeill believe, for example, that rich people should be entitled to free treatment on the NHS, for example, having their hip operations paid for by the National Health Service? If so, what distinguishes that from prescriptions?
Mark, we all know, this is why we have to have a debate about universality. We all know that universal healthcare doesn't cure the inequality between rich and poor. There is a fundamental debate here. Universality in itself does not cure some of those ills. It's a dishonest position to say that universality cures all. It's not a bad thing. But what we're arguing, that in deciding how to cut spending and who shall take more of the strain, is even more important than deciding how much the cut should be. This is what Joseph Rowntree Trust say. It's very, very important that we get this right, that we get beyond the referendum. Whatever the constitutional position will be, we will still have those problems. To put it off since 2010 and then into 2014 and 2016 is a betrayal of the people that we want to represent in here. We need to act. John Swinney knows we needed to act. He's been prevented from acting. He's lost the debate in the Cabinet, and we need somebody to make that case in the Cabinet. And we need an SNP government that can match the rhetoric with action.
Thank you very much. Now calling Jamie Hepburn. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President Officer, and let me begin by thanking the Scottish Government for bringing forward today's debate. Can I first of all say to Duncan McNeill, no one, I think, on these benches is suggesting for a moment that universality is the cure-all. No one is suggesting that universality is the only route to tackling poverty. I don't think anyone on these benches has argued that proposition. I tell you what might actually help us begin to tackle poverty a little more, though, Mr McNeill. It might be transferring the levers of economic control to this place where you sit, rather than keeping them in the hands of the Tories, which you're currently campaigning to do right now. Can I say, before I get on to the wider issues underpinning universalism, I want to quickly speak about the council tax freeze, because that was picked up on during the debate. Mr Rennie made an extraordinary comment. I think he suggested that a council tax freeze is okay in the good times, and I suppose the flip side of that must be that it's bad in the bad times. I think that's a peculiar form of economic illiteracy. Surely, if any time is right to bring forward a council tax freeze, it is in the bad times when families are struggling to make ends meet. You freeze the council tax to reduce the burden on them. That's surely the correct time to freeze the council tax. It would be interesting to hear if Mr Rennie thinks it is the right time to increase tax and increase the burden of taxation on families and people. Siobhan McMahon also suggested that she had, briefly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful to the member for giving way. If the council tax is a regressive form of taxation, how can freezing a regressive form of taxation be progressive? Could the member just explain that to me?
Well, I mean, if it wasn't to be frozen, presumably it would have continued under the trajectory it was under the Labour Party, increasing exponentially, and right now the burden would be increased on across the board, including on the very poorest families in society. So I think that's a peculiar line of argument to have taken. Mr Smith, let me turn to the comments of Siobhan McMahon about the council tax fees. I don't want to take up too much time on this, because I want to focus on the wider issues, but she suggested that she had the concern about the effect and the quality of local services through the council tax freeze, and that we need to have an honest debate about this. Well, I think that's very interesting, because South Lanarkshire is in Ms McMahon's area, and I've got a leaflet here, a copy of a leaflet here distributed by the Hamilton Labour Party for the council elections in May 2012. South Lanarkshire Labour's pledge is the very first pledge to protect our frontline services and freeze the council tax. If she feels that that is a dishonest position, I suggest she gets her own party's house in order before she comes to start to lecture other parties about their own particular position. But let me turn now to the focus on the wider principles about universalism, because, and Christine Graham did mention this, the government has set solidarity and cohesion as two of its main purpose targets, and we have seen that the SCVO have issued a report recently which I think fundamentally set out that solidarity and cohesion would be undermined with a rollback of universalism. They set out in their report, in the UK, means testing has expanded steadily to overshadow the contributory principle to a degree that isn't matched in Nordic countries, Germany or the Netherlands, for example. In part, this explains why public attitudes to benefit recipients have become harsher. And we have other evidence as well. The Welfare Reform Committee, One-Parent Families Scotland, set out that universal benefits are very efficient to deliver. Once a means test is introduced, it has to be administered and policed, which is very expensive. I agree with those perspectives. And it isn't the case, and it has been remarked, it isn't the case that we're able to provide every service universally, but this government, the SNP government, has made progress in widening an array of universal benefits, and I think that should be welcomed. We should be avoiding a rollback of these advances. I want to, I've got some time left, President, so I want to focus on one or two, if I have time, of the specific changes that I'm referring to. When the policy of phasing out prescription charges was introduced, there were, I think Bob Doris made this point, around 600,000 adults living in Scotland with an annual income of less than £16,000 who were not entitled to free prescriptions. There's a lot of talk about ending the free prescriptions policy and ensuring that those who can afford to pay can pay. But let's remember those 600,000 people who earn less than £16,000 who had to pay. They are people like the individual that one of my constituents, who is a pharmacist, once told me of cases of people coming to the pharmacy in tears when they realised they couldn't afford their prescription. If that anecdotal evidence isn't enough, then we can look at the evidence, the research that's been undertaken. In 2008, there was a review of 173 studies into prescription charges in 15 high-income countries, and that found that prescription charges led patients to forgo the use of essential drugs, reduced adherence to treatment and increased the likelihood of needing more intensive care and indeed dying. So this idea that we should roll back free prescriptions should be rejected, I think. I also want to talk about the National Concessionary Bus Pass scheme. Unlike Ms Graham or Mr Dornan, I am not of an age to benefit by it, but I do support this initiative, and I think it's very interesting to hear Mr McIntosh, as he said at the start, he made great play of the fact that it was his party that introduced it as if it was their ball to burst. Well, frankly, if his party isn't prepared to back it when it comes before committee in this place, if they set up a cuts commission that says nothing's off the table, then it's no wonder that some will begin to think that the concessionary travel scheme is under threat at the hands of the Labour Party. Scotland's public services are safe in the hands of the SNP.
Many thanks. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Willie Rennie up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I thought Bob Doris started off in a very reasonable, consensual way. I was very impressed. He flipped halfway through, but he was very reasonable and sensible about explaining the tax, spending and charging responsibilities of a government. I thought he presented the UK's tax changes in a very reasonable way and actually gave credit to us, I thought, to the changes to the tax threshold raising to £10,000, which I was very grateful for Bob Doris for doing. And I thought there was kind of three issues. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that.
Bob Doris.
Can I thank Mr Rennie for his kind words, but just for clarity in the chamber, I should point out, I think, that cutting the upper rate of taxation from 50% to 45% for those earning over £150,000 a year is an appalling policy decision by the UK Government.
Willie Rennie.
Bob Doris should never be embarrassed about praising the UK Government for some of its tax changes. He should always be proud of doing so, and I'll give him any kind of encouragement he needs at any time in order to do so. But I thought there was three main arguments that I thought was actually a reasonable debate today that were drawn out about the universalism as a principle and as a policy. One was from Claire Adamson, where she was talking about buy-in, and I have to say that it's quite compelling, the argument about that society as a whole needs to be bought in to if it contributes in taxation, it needs to get something back. And I think there's a strong argument in favour of things being free in order for people to feel that they're part of that wider society. But I don't think we should allow ourselves for people to believe that other services are not universal. If we can concede the only things that were once being charged for and are now free are the universal services, I think that ignores, for instance, roads, schools, hospitals, the police service. All these issues I regard as universal services that are available to everybody. Now, we never charged for these things, presumably we did before with the NHS, but in recent times we haven't charged for any of these services, but people, I don't think, regard them as universal services. So I think as part of that argument, we need to be able to explain to people that universal services go beyond prescription charges, bus services and tuition fees. I think that's important, but it's a valid point that she makes. Mark MacDonald's point about stigma also I thought was interesting as well, and I think there's also a valid argument, and that was one of the main arguments around about free school meals. If kids see their friends getting free meals and they're not getting free meals, it's causing a divide within the school. And I accept that as part of the argument. But as Malcolm Chisholm pointed out, many of the welfare benefits at Westminster are targeted. Most of the welfare benefits are targeted. It's not universal. So we need to be careful with that principle. We do accept that it's an issue and it should be factored into the debate, but it's not an absolute, and it's not something that we'd also always apply at all times. Otherwise, the cost would be extortionate. And the other part is that it costs more to means test. And I'm sure under some circumstances, perhaps under prescription charges, that is the case. If the cost overall is not that significant, then means testing is not of value. But again, we should not extrapolate that principle beyond the limited areas that it's covered just now. Because if that was the case, everything would be free, because otherwise means testing would be so expensive that it would be no worth doing. So I think those were really important points to raise, but they shouldn't be taken as broader golden principles that should never be breached. And that was why it was quite interesting that everybody like Bob Doris was actually quite reasonable presenting the fact that this is all about choices. But when it came to the issue, they said that universalism was a principle. I heard nobody say that the charges I read out earlier on in terms of dental charges and eye charges and care charges up in Perth and Kinross, or even legal aid that others have mentioned. Nobody said that the principle of universalism should apply to those. Nobody was proposing to go further. And I take Jamie Hepburn's point that this is perhaps about how far you take universalism. But if that was publicly said by the First Minister today in his speech to the STUC, I would have more respect for the position. But the position is presented as something that, as a golden principle, has never been breached. And only the SNP can protect it. And we know that is simply not the case, because other parties support universal services in many areas, including the NHS, schools, police, nurseries, roads and many, many other areas. Welfare reform was mentioned in several areas, and I agree with Christine Graham about the rhetoric of strivers and skivers. I don't buy into that, and I don't think it helps for politicians in Westminster to make that case that it is that divide, because I think there are many people who need that safety net and should never be considered as skivers. So I agree with Christine Graham, but she, along with Christine McKelvey, presented a position where it was they were not proposing any change to the welfare budget at Westminster. Now, accept that a big proportion of the welfare budget is pensions, but the rest of it is welfare, and it is very expensive. And what we need to do is find a way to reform it. Everybody says we need to reform it, but nobody says how we should reform it. And those who are not in favour of any reform need to consider that the cost of restoring the welfare benefits in Scotland alone would be £2.5 billion. Now, I've not heard anybody in the Chamber today suggest how they're going to pay for that. And that's what parliaments have to deal with, how they pay for things. And at the end of this is about affordability that Graham Pearson said, and Liz Smith also said, that we need to grapple with the competing and conflicting choices that we face.
Let's close,
if we don't
please.
do that as a parliament, we're letting the country down. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Gavin Brown. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me pick up on a couple of the points from the debate before taking a few other points forward. I think the first one to pick up on is we had a number of speakers from the government side today talk about how critical it is that all NHS services should be free at the point of delivery. This was their argument against prescription charging. And that sounded good until the issue of dental treatment was brought into the debate. And nobody at all on the government side, and perhaps the Minister will, as he does his concluding remarks, will explain why, if this is a principle that cannot be breached according to this government, why do people pay in this country, or many people in this country, pay for dental treatment? Isn't that discrimination between those who can afford to pay and those who cannot afford to pay? Because if the other argument that was run today, that it costs a lot more money to means test, then why on earth do we not have free dental treatment in this country today if means testing is genuinely more expensive? And I hope the government can answer that question. We heard Deputy Presiding Officer James Dorman in his contribution accused all the other parties of scaremongering in the course of their speeches, but without skipping a beat, and a sentence later then stated somewhat blithely that all the other parties want to end all universal benefits in Scotland. I don't know if he does a great line in irony, but perhaps he wants to explain what he meant by that comment.
James Dornan.
It would have been a magnificent line of irony if only it was true. I didn't say that we want to end all universal benefits at any stage in my speech, and I think if you check the record later on, you'll find that wasn't the case.
Brown.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I look forward to checking the record, and I make it absolutely clear, certainly in our party, we think we ought to review where priorities are and where we get value for money, but we certainly at no point have said that universal benefits ought to be ended. We simply think that for some there ought to be adaptations. Deputy Presiding Officer, the principal point, though, I made in my opening remarks was that to have a serious debate on this subject, and I am convinced that a serious debate is merited, we have to have the evidence base, we have to have the data. Only with that in mind can we reflect carefully and choose the absolute correct priorities for this country. And I'm still unconvinced by the government's reasoning for failing to give us 10-year or even shorter projections than that. When the independent budget review was published, that was before That was before a UK Government spending review. It was before a Scottish Government spending review. But at that point, the Cabinet Secretary was able to give the independent budget review projections for the universal services that we have been debating today. So I ask again, if it was possible then, why on earth is it not possible now to give us the data so that all of us across this chamber can have a serious debate on that issue? Now, this issue, in my view, was picked up, I think, quite rightly by the Finance Committee when we reported on demographic change. Recommendation 24 of the committee was that the committee invites the Scottish Government to provide details of the work it is currently carrying out in forecasting the budgetary implications of demographic change. That was agreed without division across that entire committee. The committee was asking for that information, Deputy Presiding Officer. In the Government's response, which came out last month, we weren't given the information in terms of projections, but I note they state this. The guidance makes clear that single outcome agreements should show what will be different for communities in 10 years and the action that will be taken in response. So the Scottish Government is asking councils and community planning partnerships to outline what is going to be different in 10 years' time and what action they intend to take in response to those differences. But when it comes to central government policies put forward by the Scottish Government, they are unable, unwilling to do so. And I think we deserve an explanation of why that is the case. Deputy Presiding Officer, we have touched on a range of issues that could be looked at more deeply, concessionary travel just being one of them. But for a budget which is pushing close now to £200 million, I think it is worthy of a greater review. And it might not come as a surprise to learn that the Scottish Government actually did have a review of the concessionary travel scheme in 2009. Paragraph 181 of that report said, "There may be a case in the future for examining the value for money of concessionary travel for those passengers over the age of 60 in full-time employment and earning a salary." Recommendation 8 was that further work should be undertaken specifically to examine the long-term sustainability of the scheme. So if that was the position of the Scottish Government and the review of the scheme in 2009, why is it not the position of the Scottish Government today? Because the Christie Commission said quite rightly that the issue of universality is usually passed as free provision for all versus means testing, whereas there are several other mechanisms, such as varying the age of eligibility, which can also reduce the spend. Deputy Presiding Officer, we have to target our resources carefully, and we repeat our request once again to the Scottish Government, particularly in summing up, why will they not give us the data so that we can have the debate? Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Kezia-Dugdale, up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thought Willie Rennie got it right when he said that the SNP want the public to believe that they only believe in universalism and everybody else wants targeted benefits, that universalism is somehow a golden principle in the SNP. But the blunt reality is that's simply not true. There are a number of targeted benefits that the SNP have presided over since they came to power in 2007. And he's already mentioned dental treatment. But what about optical vouchers, travel costs to hospitals, student bursaries, independent learning accounts, educational maintenance allowance, energy assistance packages, shared equity schemes? I could go on and on and on. But you could also suggest that the government might just argue back and say, oh, we've not got round to reforming those yet, or we would have reformed those if we had the cash. But we also know that that's not true, because there are at least 6 SNP MSPs that I've got on record supporting targeted interventions, supporting targeted benefits. Mike Russell, Kenneth Gibson, Alex Neil, Kenny McCaskill, John Swinney, Shona Robeson, all on record supporting targeted benefits. Now, I could go through the quotes for all of them, but I won't. I'll just pick on 3, starting with the Cabinet Secretary for Health. When he was asked about the Energy Assistance Programme, he said, the purpose of redesigning the programme was to target it more at pensioners and families who most require assistance to make their homes more energy efficient and who are at the lower end of the income scale. Number 2, Kenny McCaskill, Cabinet Secretary for Justice. He said, "I am pleased to see that many people in the justice system have accepted the principle that it is right that those who can afford to pay towards the cost of their defence should do so." Number 3, Mike Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education. Put bluntly, universality now drags down both the quality of services to those most in need and the ability of government to provide such services. However, and here's the key, our political parties do not have the courage to address the issues for fear of losing votes. Now, the blunt reality, Presiding Officer, is if all these 6 MSPs got together in Cabinet, they could have a Cabinet full of people that supported targeted benefits. They could vote for it, but they won't, and we know why, because in their view it's not a vote winner. What that does to me, Presiding Officer, is expose a government driven by focus group politics rather than political leadership which is designed to drive rather than follow public opinion. Joanne Lamont, however, I believe has demonstrated real political leadership on this issue, and she did it when she said...
Order.
She did it when she said, what we have here is a debate between competing good things. What the SNP want to caricature this debate as is good versus evil. Their finance-defying front bench who will protect everyone from the dark forces on these benches who are apparently out to steal hard-fought benefits and services away. The reality is that this is not a cartoon strip. No, thank you, Mark MacDonald. It's a parliament filled with real people motivated to enter politics to make a difference. Whatever our differing ideological perspective, we are all here with the same purpose, to serve the public, to debate and to make hard choices together about how that money is spent. In that sense, we are all on the same side. And I say to the Finance Secretary that we both agree the need for both targeted and universal benefits. Let's just be honest about that. We just disagree perhaps on the mix. And it does Parliament no good in the parliamentary knockabout to pretend that our positions are black versus white, good versus evil. In the words of the Christie Commission, what we need is non-polarised and transparent environment in which to debate. We need to raise the standard of the debate. And I'll try and do that by taking on Christina McKelvey's contribution earlier on. She posed the question, whatever happened to tackling child poverty? Well, I would say to her, Labour managed to lift 600,000 children out of child poverty, and we did that with a targeted public policy approach. Public policy that was targeted at women. The national minimum wage, tax credits, part-time jobs and, crucially, part-time rights with trade unions to reinforce them, childcare, paternity rights, maternity rights, concerted attempts across portfolios targeted at women. And let me take that argument and apply it to John Swinney's opening remarks, where he admitted that his reformed colleges programme has led to fewer part-time opportunities and more positions for young people. The consequence of fewer part-time places in colleges is a detrimental impact on women, and we will feel that for years to come in our child poverty statistics. The employment stats already demonstrate it. Inactivity amongst women up 25,000 in the year, down 1,000 for men. Inactivity rate up 1.4% in Scotland, but down 1% in the UK. The trends are going the wrong way for this Cabinet Secretary. And when he hailed the progress on youth employment, which I welcome, he has to recognise that that is not the result of young people moving into jobs. That's the result of young people moving out of the employment statistics altogether through inactivity. And while I could go as far to argue that the Scottish Government's approach to youth employment is targeted as well rather than universal, it's all focused on the business end of the market, on helping young people closest to getting into the job market. And you completely abandon the young people who have been out of work for 2 years or more. It's a targeted approach driven by your need to satisfy statistics and get a good press release out. I've only got a minute and a half left, Presiding Officer, so I can't pay tribute to Siobhan McMahon's speech and the important things that she said there about higher education. But let me just say to Mark MacDonald, it's the last time I give you some nice small chat in the canteen, because that exposed things, did it not? But for such a bright guy, I have never failed to be astonished by Mark MacDonald's inability to get it. What Joanne Lamont is doing is opening up a debate. She's asking for people's thoughts and opinions. She's not so set in stone that she can't move. I'm sorry the word debate is so hard for people in the SNP to understand when they're clearly given their microchip at the beginning of the week and told to reiterate it for the rest. In closing, Presiding Officer, this squabble that we've had today, I'm in the last minute, I'm sorry, Mark. I'm in the last minute. This squabble today of universal versus targeted, public versus private, good versus evil is simply a cloak a huge diversionary tactic from what is really going on, which is a blatant attempt to park difficult decisions, unsustainable spending commitments and the hard truths about our ageing population until after the referendum. It's a deeply cynical ploy which seeks only to widen the cracks in our already broken politics. The SNP will no doubt wake up to the challenges that we face the day after the referendum. If they win, the referendum deceit will all have been worth it, and if they lose it, it will be somebody else's problem. That is what is so sad about today's debate. Whilst the SNP promise all things to all people and plead that they have the moral high ground on universality, people suffer and hard choices are ignored.
Now, please.
The very hard choices that we were elected to make. I support Ken McIntosh's motion.
Thanks very much. I now call on Alec Neil, Cabinet Secretary, up to 5 o'clock, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I rise to support John Swinney's motion on the order paper. It's now 4 years since the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, promised us cuts that were deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher. And at that time he was promising, in terms of the Scottish Government budget, a 40% reduction in our capital budget and a near 10% reduction in our resource budget. And when we got that news, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government had to take some very important, difficult, tough, strategic decisions. And contrary to what Duncan McNeill said, we faced up to the reality that there would be another 16 years before the real value terms of our budget would be back to what it was before Alistair Darling became the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And we took the following decisions, led by John Swinney in the Cabinet. First of all, we had to make a choice whether to maximise the number of jobs in Scotland and the number of people in work, or allow pay rises to continue in line with inflation. And given that inflation at that time was between 4 and 5%, we took the very difficult decision that jobs was the priority. It's much more important to keep as many people in work as we possibly can. And the price we all had to pay for that was a pay freeze so that we could keep the maximum number of people in work. That was a tough decision, a tough choice, but this government faced up to that reality. Second major decision we took, Presiding Officer, was that within that policy we would ensure as far as possible that those who had the broadest shoulders would bear the bulk of the burden, and we would help those who were low paid, in poverty and most vulnerable. So even although we froze wages for everyone else, we gave a pay rise to everybody earning less than £21,000 a year. But we also, took other major decisions. We decided to pass on the Barnett consequentials to the National Health Service at a time when no one else in this Parliament agreed with that policy. We took a decision to make prescriptions universally free because of the evidence referred to earlier by Christine Graham. We took the decision to maintain concessionary travel for our older and disabled people and extended it to disabled veterans as well. We took the decision to abolish the tuition fees that Labour had introduced, and most recently we have taken the decision to give all-out opposition to the Tory Liberal policy of a bedroom tax that will do so much damage in Scotland and elsewhere. Duncan, I'm happy to take your intervention if you can stop your conversation. Duncan, I'm happy to take your intervention. I'm happy to take his intervention. Oh, right. OK, he's not taking the intervention. Presiding Officer, I'll come to that. There are three major strategic challenges that we face as a nation because we are living in austerity Britain. The first one is the budgetary challenge. As I have already mentioned, the budget cuts imposed in this Parliament are very deep and very damaging. Now, we live on a fixed budget. At the moment, we don't have the power to borrow, we don't have the power to tax. So whatever budget is handed down to us, we have to accept at the present time. And, I have to laugh at the Tories demanding a 10-year forecast. In the Chancellor's budget 2 or 3 weeks ago, he cut our budget for this year by another £50 million and a budget for next year by another £50 million. They can't forecast days ahead, never mind decades ahead.
Gavin Brown.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and he's being a little disingenuous on this point. What are the projected 10-year costs? They were able to do it for the independent budget review. Why are they unable to do it now?
Presiding Officer, Mr Swinney has already explained in inordinate detail why that is not possible. And let me just go on to say this about the budgetary challenge. You know, if we had not had the Scottish Futures Trust, then we would have had to invent it. And I remember the Labour Party, the Tories and the Liberals ridiculing the Scottish Futures Trust, another policy led by Mr Swinney, Mr McNeill. And if we hadn't had the Scottish Futures Trust at the moment, we wouldn't be investing £2.5 billion that otherwise we wouldn't have. Now I'll take Mr Macintosh.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary? Can I ask Mr Neil what he thinks Mr Swinney means when he says the Scottish public sector may be able to limit individual pay increases over the short term and constrain total increases in pay bill costs through management of the size of the workforce? What does that mean?
What it means, Mr Macintosh, is that we have to cope with the budget cuts imposed by Alistair Darling and by George Osborne. I've said already, we took a strategic decision to keep jobs as the #1 priority. We have stuck to that. We have had a policy of no compulsory redundancy. And I have to say, speaking as the Cabinet Secretary for Health, we won't be taking any lessons from the Labour Party about cuts in budgets or jobs. Down south, this is the party that they cut the NHS budget by £20 billion, while we are passing on the Barnett consequentials to the National Health Service. So, Presiding Officer, unlike these three unionist parties, we are rising to the challenge. But, you know, I want to pick out something. That Malcolm Chisholm said. Malcolm Chisholm said the underlying current of this debate isn't about universalism but about independence. Can I say to Malcolm Chisholm, for whom I have the highest respect, he and many others like him will have a choice to make next year, and the choice will be a simple choice. It will be a choice of two futures: a future in austerity Britain, being run by the Tories and the Liberal poodles, or a future in a prosperous Scotland. Let me forecast, Presiding Officer. Since everybody wants a forecast, I'll finish with 3 forecasts. Forecast one will be enough. Next year we'll get a yes vote. Forecast 2 will be independent by 2016. And forecast 3, within 5 to 10 years, will be one of the richest countries in the world.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the debate on universal services, and it's now time to move to the next item of business, which is decision time. And there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business, and I would wish to remind members that if the amendment in the name of Gavin Brown is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Willie Rennie will fall. The first question is that Amendment 6225.3 in the name of Ken Macintosh, which seeks to amend motion number 6225 in the name of John Swinney on universal services, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. Therefore, we will move to a vote, and members should cast their vote now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 6225.3 in the name of Ken Macintosh is yes 38, no 72. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore agreed. Not agreed, I beg your pardon. Not agreed. The second question is that amendment 6225.2 in the name of Gavin Brown, which seeks to amend motion number 6225 in the name of John Swinney on universal services, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their vote now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 6225.2 in the name of Gavin Brown is yes 15, no 94. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 6225.1 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend a motion number 6225 in the name of John Swinney on universal services, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their vote now, please. The result of the vote on amendment number 6225.1 in the name of Willie Rennie is yes 15, no 95. There were no abstentions and the amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question is that motion number 6225 in the name of John Swinney on universal services be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and members should cast their vote now, please. The result of the vote on motion number 6225 in the name of John Swinney is yes 62, no 48. There were no abstentions and the motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. I will now move to the next item of business.